Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The cable car shouldn't have been running. That was my first mistake. Assuming the rusted sign reading closed for maintenance was just another bureaucratic oversight. Another piece of red tape left hanging long after its purpose had expired. The second mistake was stepping into that swaying metal coffin when everything in my gut screamed against it. But I needed to get to the summit. The research station had been silent for 3 weeks, and as the only geologist willing to make the trek during off-season, I'd convinced myself this was just another routine check. The university needed their equipment recovered before winter set in proper, and the hazard pay would cover my rent for 6 months. Simple job. In and out. The operator emerged from the control booth like something dragged from a fever dream. His coveralls hung loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk over the years, and his fingers... Christ, his fingers were black with something that wasn't quite grease, wasn't quite oil. When he spoke, his voice carried the rasp of a man who'd spent too many years breathing mountain air and diesel fumes. "You sure about this? Weather's turning." I glanced at the sky. Gray, but not threatening. "How long to the top?" 23 minutes, give or take." He pulled out a small notebook, its pages warped and stained with dark smudges. The cover had been worn smooth, and I could make out the ghost of text that might have once read, "Maintenance log," or something similar. Cable's been... temperamental. The car lurched into motion before I could ask what he meant by temperamental. Through the scratched plexiglass windows, the ground fell away beneath us, revealing the true scope of the mountain's face. A wall of granite and scree that dropped into mist-shrouded valleys. The cable stretched ahead, disappearing into low-hanging clouds that clung to the upper reaches like cobwebs. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my teeth ache, metal grinding against metal, a shriek that seemed to come from the cable itself. The entire car shuddered, and I grabbed the safety rail, knuckles white against rust-pitted steel. Behind me, furious scribbling. The operator's pen moved across the notebook's pages with desperate intensity, his whole body hunched over the task, as if his life depended on getting every detail down exactly right. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't catch over the wind and the machinery's constant hum. "What are you writing?" He didn't look up. "Maintenance notes. Got to log every anomaly, every sound. They want everything documented." His pen never stopped moving. Been doing this for 17 years. Never missed a single entry. The cable shrieked again, longer this time, and the car swayed with enough force to make my stomach lurch. The operator's writing became even more frantic, his hand moving so fast I wondered how he could possibly be forming coherent words. When I tried to peer over his shoulder, he hunched further, protecting the notebook like a man guarding his last meal. "Who's they?" "Mountain Authority, insurance, safety inspectors." His voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if he'd rehearsed these answers. "They want to know about every stress point, every potential failure. Can't be too careful when you're suspended 800 feet above nothing." 800 feet. I hadn't realized we'd climbed so high. Through the windows, the world had transformed into something alien. A landscape of stone and shadow where trees looked like scattered toothpicks and the road we'd followed became a hairline crack in the earth. The mist had thickened around us, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet in any direction. The shrieking came again, and this time it didn't stop. It rose and fell like some enormous animal in pain, and the cable car's motion became erratic, lurching forward, then slowing, then accelerating again as if the mechanism couldn't decide what it wanted to do. The operator's writing had devolved into something that looked more like frantic sketching, his pen digging deep enough into the paper to tear through in places. Jesus, how much further? 6 minutes, maybe 7. He finally looked up, and I saw that his eyes held the particular exhaustion of a man who'd seen too much and understood too little. It's worse when there's only one passenger. The weight distribution throws everything off balance. I wanted to ask what he meant, Surely they'd run the car empty during maintenance cycles. But another grinding shriek cut through the air, and the car tilted at an angle that made my inner ear scream warnings. Through the window, I caught glimpses of the cable above us, thick as my forearm and dark, with something that might have been protective coating, or might have been something else entirely. The mist began to thin as we climbed higher, revealing patches of the summit station ahead. From this distance, it looked abandoned, windows dark, the platform empty except for drifts of snow that had settled in the corners. No signs of life, no indication that anyone had been up there recently. When was the last time someone took this ride? The operator consulted his notebook, flipping back through pages of cramped handwriting. 3 weeks, 2 days, party of 4, scientists like you. He paused, pen hovering over a fresh page. Only 3 came back down. My blood turned to ice water. What happened to the 4th? Decided to stay, said he had more work to do. The operator shrugged, but his hand trembled slightly as he prepared to write. Happens sometimes. People get up there, see the view, and something just clicks. Like they belong to the mountain now. The cable car lurched to a stop with a grinding finality that suggested the machinery was as relieved as I was to end the journey. The operator moved to the door controls, but before he opened them, he grabbed my arm with one of those oil-stained hands. His grip was stronger than his appearance suggested. Word of advice? Don't stay up there too long. And when you walk around the observation deck, he glanced down at his notebook, where fresh ink was already drying on whatever he'd been writing during our conversation. Watch where you step. Sometimes the mountain shows you things that aren't quite ready to be seen. The door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and cold mountain air flooded the car. I stepped onto the platform, legs unsteady after 23 minutes of swaying and lurching, and immediately understood what the operator meant about the weight distribution. The entire structure felt precarious, as if it were balanced on the edge of something much larger and less stable than the concrete foundations would suggest. The research station squatted ahead of me like a concrete bunker, its windows reflecting the gray sky in a way that made them look like dead eyes. But it was the observation deck that drew my attention. A circular platform extending out over the cliff face, surrounded by safety railings that looked inadequate against the drop beyond. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the thin air, and that's when I noticed them. Oil stains on the concrete, dark, viscous marks that formed the perfect outline of boot prints, leading from where I stood toward the deck's railing. They were fresh, so fresh they seemed to gleam wetly in the pale light, and they matched my boots exactly. I lifted my foot, checking the sole. Dry, clean except for the normal wear patterns and a bit of dried mud from the parking area 800 feet below. When I looked back at the oil prints, they were still there, still gleaming, still leading toward the edge of the world. But here's the thing that made my scalp prickle with primitive terror. When I looked directly at them, focused my gaze on any individual print, it became just a stain on concrete, ambiguous, possibly just water damage or old spills from maintenance equipment. It was only in my peripheral vision that they resolved into perfect duplicates of my own steps. I followed them anyway. What else could I do? The observation deck extended 30 feet over the cliff face, held up by steel supports that disappeared into the mist below. The oil prints led me past information plaques describing the geological features of the mountain range, past memorial benches dedicated to climbers and researchers who'd made this place their life's work, past the modern safety barriers with their cheerful warnings about strong winds and sudden weather changes. The prints ended at the far railing, where someone, or something, had apparently stood looking out over the abyss. When I reached the same spot and gripped the cold metal barrier, I understood why this place had claimed that 4th researcher. The view was overwhelming in a way that had nothing to do with beauty, and everything to do with the vast indifference of geological time. Mountains stretched to every horizon, their peaks disappearing into low clouds that made them seem infinite. Far below, valleys carved by glaciers and rivers created patterns that looked almost deliberate, as if some enormous intelligence had shaped the landscape according to principles too large for human comprehension. Standing there, I felt the mountain's weight pressing down from above and pulling up from below, as if I were caught between two immense forces that cared nothing for my existence. The wind carried sounds that might have been other cable cars in the distance, or might have been something else entirely. A low moaning that seemed to come from the rock itself. That's when I noticed the footprints behind me. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see, and found a trail of oil stains leading back the way I'd come. But these weren't my prints from the journey out. These were different, deeper, more purposeful, as if whoever had made them carried more weight than I did, and they were still appearing, one by one, as I watched in my peripheral vision. Someone was following me, someone whose steps left the same oil signature as mine, but who moved with more certainty, more authority, someone who knew this place better than I did. I backed against the railing, the metal cold against my spine even through my jacket. The prints continued to appear, closing the distance between whoever was making them and where I stood. When I tried to count them, tried to track their progress by looking directly at each stain, they dissolved into meaningless marks on concrete. But the moment I looked away, they snapped back into perfect clarity, and the trail had advanced another few feet. The cable car's machinery groaned somewhere behind me, metal protesting against metal, and I heard the faint scratch of pen on paper carried by the wind. The operator was still down there, still writing in his grease-stained notebook, still documenting anomalies that the mountain authority needed to know about. I understood then that I was the anomaly. The research station's door stood ajar, revealing darkness beyond the threshold. Whatever had happened to the fourth researcher, whatever had made him decide to stay on the mountain, was probably waiting inside that building. The equipment I'd come to recover, the instruments worth 6 months of rent, they were secondary now to the growing certainty that I wasn't alone up here. The oil prints had reached the halfway point of the deck. In my peripheral vision, I could see them continuing to advance, methodical and patient, as if whoever was making them had all the time in the world. When I shifted position, trying to get a better view of what might be casting these impossible footprints, the trail shifted too, always maintaining that same distance, always approaching but never quite arriving. Down below, the cable car's engine coughed and died. The sudden silence was worse than the mechanical noise had been, because now I could hear other sounds. The whisper of wind through steel cables, the creak of the observation deck's supports, and underneath it all, something that might have been breathing. I pulled out my phone, thinking to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. Of course. We were 800 feet above civilization, surrounded by granite peaks that blocked radio waves as effectively as they blocked escape routes. The only way down was the cable car, and the cable car wasn't going anywhere until the operator decided it was time. The oil prints had covered 2/3 of the distance now. Soon, whatever was making them would reach the railing where I stood, and I'd discover whether the mountain's appetite for researchers extended to geologists who asked too many questions and stayed too long. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the fourth researcher hadn't disappeared at all. Maybe he'd just learned what I was learning now, that some places claimed ownership of anyone who understood them too well. The mountain had shown him something in these oil footprints, some truth about the relationship between observer and observed, and he'd made the rational choice to stop fighting it. I could feel that same choice approaching with each new print that appeared in my peripheral vision. The rational choice. The choice that made sense when you were suspended 800 feet above the world with nowhere to run and no way to unsee what you'd already seen. Behind me, the abyss yawned wide and patient. Ahead of me, the impossible footprints continued their methodical advance, and somewhere in between, in the space where my shadow fell across oil-stained concrete, I began to understand what the operator had been writing in his notebook all these years. He'd been documenting the process, recording each stage of how the mountain claimed its own, noting the exact moment when a person stopped being a visitor and became part of the place they'd come to study. The footprints were almost close enough to touch now, and I realized I could no longer tell which prints were mine and which belonged to my approaching shadow. They'd begun to merge, oil flowing into oil, until the trail looked like it had been made by a single person who'd walked this path many times before. The cable car's engine coughed back to life with a sound like metal tearing, and I heard the operator's voice drifting up through the thin air. though I couldn't make out his words. He was probably calling to me, probably warning that the weather was changing and it was time to head back down the mountain. But the weather had already changed. I could feel it in the weight of the air, in the way the mist moved around the platform, in the certainty that the oil footprints trailing behind me would be there long after I was gone. The mountain had shown me its secret, and now I understood what had happened to the fourth researcher. He hadn't disappeared. He'd simply stopped leaving footprints that were visible to anyone else. As I walked back toward the cable car, I didn't look down at the concrete beneath my feet. I didn't need to. I could feel the oil seeping up through the soles of my boots, marking each step with the same dark signature that would remain here long after the maintenance crews thought they'd cleaned everything up. The operator was waiting for me with his notebook open, pen poised over a fresh page. When he saw me approaching, he began to write with that same frantic intensity I'd witnessed on the way up. But this time, I thought I understood what he was documenting. He was recording my departure, noting the exact time and conditions when the mountain's newest resident began his journey back down to the world below, writing down what I looked like, how I moved, whether I seemed to be all there. Because next week, or next month, or next year, someone else would need to make this trip. Another researcher, another geologist, another person who thought they could study the mountain without being studied in return. And when they arrived at the summit and walked out onto the observation deck, they'd see the oil footprints I was leaving now. Footprints that would only appear when they weren't looking directly. Footprints that would lead them to the railing where they'd discover what I'd discovered. The cable car door closed behind me with a sound like a coffin lid, and we began our descent through the mist. The operator continued writing, his pen scratching across pages that were already full of similar entries. Similar observations about similar visitors who'd thought they were coming up here to collect equipment or conduct research or simply enjoy the view. I closed my eyes and listened to the cable sing as we dropped toward the world below, carrying me back to my apartment and my university job and my normal life. But even with my eyes closed, I could see the oil footprints spreading across the observation deck, waiting for the next person who needed to understand what it meant to be truly observed. The mountain kept its secrets by sharing them, and now I was part of that process, part of the cycle that brought people up to the summit and sent them back down changed in ways they wouldn't understand until much later, if they understood at all. The operator's pen never stopped moving, documenting everything, recording it all for whoever came next. And in the growing darkness beyond the cable car's windows, I thought I could see other lights moving on other peaks, other cable cars making other journeys, carrying other people toward other observation decks where other footprints waited to be discovered. The mountain was vast and patient and hungry for understanding, and now I understood. Story 2. The gravel road ended where civilization gave up trying. My company van crunched to a stop beside a rusted mailbox that leaned at an angle suggesting defeat, its numbers barely legible through layers of desert dust and what looked like dried salt. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving me to navigate by handwritten directions scrawled on a coffee-stained napkin. The trailer sat like a metallic tumor against the endless expanse of scrubland, its aluminum siding reflecting the late afternoon sun in blinding flashes. Heat waves shimmered off its corrugated roof, creating the illusion that the entire structure was breathing. I grabbed the new wireless modem from the passenger seat, its sleek black casing still warm from the dashboard, and stepped into air that tasted of copper and sage. My boots found purchase on ground so dry it seemed to whisper complaints with each step. The installation should have been routine. Drive out, set up the modem, test the connection, collect payment, drive home. I'd done hundreds of these remote installations, bringing internet to the forgotten corners of Nevada where cell towers feared to venture. But something about this place made my skin crawl, a sensation that started between my shoulder blades and spread outward like spilled ink. The trailer's door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. No sound emerged from within, despite my van's engine announcing my arrival from miles away. I knocked, the hollow aluminum producing a sound that seemed to echo far longer than physics should allow. He appeared without warning, as if materializing from the shadows rather than walking to the door. tall and gaunt, with skin the color of old leather and eyes that reflected light like still water. His age was impossible to determine, somewhere between 50 and 70, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades letting the desert remake them in its image. His greeting came without words, just a slight nod and a gesture for me to enter. The interior smelled of ozone and something organic that I couldn't identify, like seaweed dried in sunlight. Every surface was clean to the point of obsession, yet the air itself felt thick, almost viscous, as if I was breathing through gauze. I explained the installation process while unboxing the modem, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the cramped space. He watched my every movement with an intensity that made me fumble with the power cord. When I asked about the optimal placement for signal strength, he pointed to a small table near the kitchenette without speaking. The setup proceeded normally until the moment I powered on the device. The familiar sequence of blinking lights began: power, internet, wireless. But instead of the usual electronic hum, the modem emitted something else, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed less like machinery and more like breathing. I'd installed thousands of these units. This was wrong. Before I could investigate, the man moved with startling speed. He lifted the modem with reverence, cradling it like something precious, and pressed one end against his ear. His eyes closed, and his face transformed into an expression of profound peace, the kind I'd seen on religious paintings. He stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to whatever the device was telling him. When he finally lowered it, his eyes were bright with an emotion I couldn't name. "Perfect waves," he said, his voice carrying the rust of disuse. "Listen." He extended the modem toward me, its status lights now pulsing in a pattern that didn't match any diagnostic sequence I knew. The breathing sound had intensified, accompanied by something that might have been static, or might have been the sound of distant surf. I stepped backward instinctively, my professional training warring with an ancient part of my brain that screamed danger. The man's expression shifted from beatific to puzzled, then to something darker. His grip on the modem tightened, knuckles showing white against sun-damaged skin. "You have to listen," he insisted, taking a step forward. "They're calling." The trailer's walls seemed to press inward, and I realized I could hear my own heartbeat echoing strangely in the confined space. The ozone smell had grown stronger, tinged now with something metallic that coated my tongue. I mumbled something about checking the external connections and pushed past him toward the door. Outside, the desert air felt thin and clean after the oppressive atmosphere of the trailer. I took deep breaths, trying to clear my head, but the man followed me out, still clutching the modem. He held it up to his ear again, his face cycling through expressions of joy and longing that made my stomach twist. I focused on my job, checking the exterior connections and running diagnostics on my tablet, but my eyes kept returning to the man. He'd begun walking in slow circles around the trailer, the modem pressed against his head like a phone call from God. Occasionally, he'd stop and tilt his head, as if listening to instructions, then resume his perambulation. The signal strength looked good, the connection stable. By all technical measures, the installation was successful. I should have collected payment and left, but something kept me rooted there in the dying light. The man's behavior had shifted from merely eccentric to deeply unsettling, and I found myself cataloging possible escape routes. When he finally approached me, the modem no longer at his ear, I saw them. Small, perfectly circular marks dotted the device's metal chassis, each about the size of a dime. They looked like suction marks, the kind you'd see after removing a medical device or a child's toy that had been pressed too hard against skin. But there were dozens of them, covering nearly every metallic surface. My tablet slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, its screen cracking against a stone. The man noticed my stare and followed my gaze to the modem, then back to my face. His smile revealed teeth stained the color of old copper. "They hold on tight," he explained, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Been waiting so long for a proper connection." The implications crashed over me like cold water. Those marks weren't from suction cups or medical devices. They were from something living, something that had pressed itself against the metal with enough force to leave permanent impressions. My mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. I managed to stammer something about the installation being complete, backing toward my van while he watched with those reflective eyes. But he moved to block my path, the modem cradled against his chest like a sleeping infant. "You haven't listened yet," he said, and there was hurt in his voice, the tone of a child denied a promised treat. "They specifically asked for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. How could anything in that device know I was coming? The installation had been scheduled only yesterday, a rush job to replace a failed unit, unless someone had been monitoring the service calls, tracking the technicians, learning their schedules. But that was paranoia talking. I was letting the isolation and the man's strange behavior get to me. There was a rational explanation for everything. Defective hardware producing unusual sounds, the man's loneliness manifesting as delusion, the marks on the casing from legitimate wear or damage during shipping. Yet as I looked at his face in the orange light of sunset, I saw something that chilled me more than any supernatural explanation could have. Intelligence, cunning, the expression of someone playing a game where I didn't know the rules. He set the modem on the ground between us and stepped back, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Just once," he pleaded. "They've been so patient." The device sat there in the dust, its status lights creating a small constellation against the darkening sky. The breathing sound had become more pronounced, definitely audible now without being pressed against anyone's ear. It rose and fell with organic rhythm, occasionally interrupted by what might have been whispers, or might have been the wind through distant rock formations. I found myself taking a step forward, then another. My rational mind screamed warnings, but something deeper was responding to those sounds, recognizing them as almost familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby or a voice calling from childhood dreams. The modem seemed to pulse with its own light now, the status LEDs synchronized with that organic breathing. I could see the suction marks more clearly, and with growing horror, I realized they were arranged in patterns. Deliberate, geometric designs that suggested intelligence behind their placement. My hand was reaching out before I consciously decided to move. The man's smile widened, revealing more of those copper-stained teeth, and I caught a glimpse of something else. Small circular marks on his temples, hidden beneath wispy hair, the same size as those on the modem. I jerked my hand back and ran for the van, my professional dignity forgotten in the face of pure animal terror. The engine turned over on the third try, and I reversed away from the trailer in a spray of gravel and dust. Through the windshield, I could see the man standing motionless beside the glowing modem, his face turned upward to the first stars of evening. The drive back to civilization passed in a blur of adrenaline and second-guessing. By the time I reached the highway, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted. The man was lonely, eccentric, possibly suffering from some form of dementia that made him attach significance to mundane electronic sounds. The marks on the modem were just wear patterns, and the breathing sound was a defective cooling fan. But the marks on his temples, those were harder to explain away. I filed my report as a successful installation, marking the location as customer satisfied, no follow-up required. I hoped I'd never have to think about that trailer, that man, or that breathing modem again. That was 3 weeks ago. Last night, I woke to the sound of perfect waves breaking against a shore that doesn't exist in Nevada. The sound was coming from my phone, my laptop, my smart TV. Every connected device in my apartment humming with that organic rhythm I'd heard in the desert. When I unplugged them all, the sound continued, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. This morning, I found small circular marks on my bathroom mirror, fogged with condensation from my shower. They're arranged in the same geometric patterns I saw on the modem, and when I press my finger to one, it fits perfectly. My phone is ringing now, but the caller ID shows only a string of coordinates, latitude and longitude that I recognize as the location of that trailer at the end of the world. The ringtone has changed to that breathing sound, that whisper of perfect waves on an impossible shore. I know I shouldn't answer. Every rational part of my mind is screaming warnings, begging me to throw the phone away and run, but the sound is so beautiful, so perfectly crafted to resonate with something deep in my bones. And underneath the waves, I can hear voices calling my name, promising answers to questions I didn't know I had. The marks on my temples are small, barely visible in the bathroom mirror. They'll fade, I tell myself. Everything has a rational explanation, but I can't stop listening for the waves. Story 3. The moor stretched endlessly in every direction, a carpet of heather and gorse that seemed to breathe with each gust of wind. I'd been walking for hours, my boots squelching through patches of boggy ground, the weight of my thoughts heavier than the dampness that clung to my jacket. The therapist had suggested walks, fresh air, connection with nature. She hadn't suggested walking until the world felt small enough to manage, until the vastness of my problems shrank to match the horizon. The wind carried a bite that promised frost, though it was barely past noon. Above, clouds the color of old pewter rolled across the sky, their shadows racing over the undulating landscape like something fleeing. I pulled my collar higher and continued walking, letting my feet choose the direction. There was something liberating about being lost, about having no destination except away from everything that had brought me to this point. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another cluster of white stones scattered across the moorland. But as I drew closer, the arrangement became clear, deliberate. Bones, bleached white by weather and time, formed a perfect compass rose about 3 feet across. The longer bones, what had once been legs, pointed toward the cardinal directions, while smaller ribs and vertebrae filled in the intermediate points. At the center lay a skull, no larger than my fist, empty sockets staring skyward. A rabbit, I realized, or what remained of one. The precision of the arrangement stopped me cold. This wasn't the work of scavengers or weather. Someone, or something, had carefully positioned each bone, creating a navigation tool that seemed ancient and purposeful. The white bones stood out starkly against the dark peat, as if they'd been placed there moments before, though they were clearly old. I knelt beside the compass, studying its construction. The bones showed no signs of gnawing or breakage that would suggest animal involvement. Each piece had been cleaned and positioned with an almost surgical precision. The skull faced north, its hollow gaze fixed on something beyond the horizon. A sound made me look up, a whisper of movement through the heather. Nothing. Just wind and the distant cry of a curlew. But the sensation remained. That prickle of awareness that comes from being watched. I scanned the moor, seeing only endless brown and purple stretching to the gray sky. When I looked back at the compass, I noticed something else. Small stones, dark and smooth, were scattered around the bone formation. Not randomly. They formed rough concentric circles, as if someone had been interrupted while completing a larger pattern. Without thinking, I began to gather them. The stones felt strangely warm against my palms, despite the cold air. I arranged them in neat rings around the bone compass, 3 circles deep, each stone carefully placed. The work was oddly soothing, requiring just enough concentration to quiet the constant chatter in my head. My therapist would have called it mindfulness, this focus on the simple task at hand. As I worked, the feeling of being observed intensified, not threatening exactly, but expectant, as if something was waiting to see what I would do. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently, but the moor remained empty except for the occasional sheep in the distance, white dots against the landscape like scattered thoughts. The temperature dropped as afternoon faded toward evening. My fingers grew stiff, making it harder to position the stones with the precision I somehow felt was necessary. But I continued, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name. Each stone had to be exactly right, had to complete whatever pattern was intended. By the time I finished, 3 perfect circles of dark stone surrounded the bone compass. The arrangement felt complete, purposeful, as if it had always been meant to exist in exactly this configuration. I stood back to admire my work, surprised by the satisfaction it brought me. For the first time in months, I had created something instead of merely enduring. The walk back to my car took longer than expected. Dusk settled over the moor like a blanket, and I found myself constantly looking back toward where I'd left my stone circles, though they'd long since disappeared into the gathering darkness. The feeling of being watched had faded, replaced by something stranger, a sense of connection, as if I'd completed some kind of circuit. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, curiosity drove me back to the moor before the sun had fully risen. Frost glittered on every blade of grass, turning the landscape into something crystalline and otherworldly. My breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air, and my footsteps crunched through the frozen ground. I found the spot easily, as if my feet remembered the way without conscious direction. But what I saw there made me stop, my heart hammering against my ribs. The stone circles remained exactly as I'd left them. The rabbit's skull still gazed north from the center of its bone compass, but covering everything. Every stone, every bone, even the ground between, was a thick carpet of moss so green it seemed to glow against the frost-white landscape. Moss doesn't grow overnight, especially not in a perfect circle, especially not during a hard frost that should have killed any plant life. But there it was, lush and impossibly vibrant, as if it had been growing there for years. I knelt at the edge of the moss, afraid to disturb it. The green was so rich it almost hurt to look at, and moisture beaded on its surface despite the freezing temperature. As I studied the pattern more closely, my breath caught in my throat. The moss wasn't random. It formed letters. My name, my full name, spelled out in dripping organic script across the stone circles. The moss grew thicker in some places, creating shadowy depths that gave the letters dimension, weight. They seemed to pulse with their own life, growing even as I watched. James Patterson Whitmore. I hadn't told anyone my full name since moving to this area. Hell, I barely used my middle name anymore, hadn't for years. But there it was, written in living green across the stones I'd arranged, as if the moss had read my thoughts and given them form. I reached out to touch one of the letters, the J that started my first name, but jerked my hand back at the last second. The moss seemed to lean toward my fingers, responding to my proximity like something sentient. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Coincidence? Pareidolia? Seeing patterns where none existed. The isolation and depression were making me imagine things, but the letters were too clear, too deliberate, and they were growing. I spent the rest of the morning crouched beside the moss circle, watching the letters slowly expand and deepen. The green crept outward with visible persistence, consuming frost and dead grass alike. By noon, my name covered an area twice the size of my original stone circles, the letters now thick enough to cast shadows in the pale sunlight. Other changes were occurring too. The rabbit skull had sunk deeper into the moss, only the top of its cranium still visible. The bones of the compass were being slowly engulfed, transformed from stark white to muted green. But their positions remained clear beneath the moss, creating subtle ridges that maintained the navigation pattern. I should have left then. Every instinct told me to walk away, to pretend I'd never seen this impossible growth. But I couldn't. The moss name pulled at me with the same compulsion that had driven me to arrange the stones. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest tight. Beautiful and wrong and impossible. As the day wore on, other details emerged. Tiny flowers began to appear among the moss, white blooms no larger than pinheads that gave off a faint, sweet scent. They grew only along the curves of the letters, following the organic script like decorative flourishes. The fragrance was intoxicating, reminiscent of something I couldn't quite place, something that made me think of childhood and safety and being known. The sun was setting when I finally forced myself to leave, but I could feel the moss behind me, continuing its impossible growth, spelling out my name in letters that no one else would ever see or believe. That night, I dreamed of walking through gardens made entirely of moss, where every surface was soft and green and alive. In the dream, I wasn't alone. Something walked beside me, keeping pace but never quite entering my peripheral vision. When I tried to turn and look, it would fade. leaving only the impression of presence and the lingering scent of those tiny white flowers. I woke before dawn, compelled by a need I couldn't name. The more in early morning was a different world, wreathed in mist that turned familiar landmarks into suggestions of themselves. I made my way to the moss circle by feel as much as sight, following a path that seemed to glow faintly in the pre-dawn darkness. What I found defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The moss had spread overnight into a complex mandala pattern, extending 50 feet in every direction. My name remained at the center, but now it was surrounded by spirals and geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. They seemed to shift and move when viewed from the corner of my eye, creating optical illusions that made my head swim. But it wasn't just moss anymore. Other plants had joined the impossible garden. Ferns that grew in perfect mathematical curves, flowers that bloomed in sequences that followed no earthly season, grasses that grew in patterns so complex they resembled writing in an unknown language. The rabbit's compass was now completely invisible beneath the growth, but I could still feel its presence, the navigation points marked by variations in the plant life. And I wasn't alone. Shapes moved through the mist at the edge of the garden. Not quite human, not quite animal. They glided between the standing stones that I now realized dotted the moor in patterns I'd never noticed before. They seemed to be tending the plants, encouraging certain growth patterns while discouraging others, shaping the impossible garden with careful, deliberate movements. One of the shapes paused near where I crouched in the heather, and for a moment the mist cleared enough for me to see it clearly. Tall and impossibly thin, it moved with joints that bent in too many directions. Its face, if it had a face, was turned toward me, and I felt the weight of its attention like a physical thing. "Why?" I whispered, the word barely audible even to myself. The shape tilted what might have been its head, and I heard a sound like wind through distant trees, like water running over stones, like the sighs that plants make as they grow. It wasn't speech, but somehow I understood. Because you completed the circuit, because you saw what was meant to be seen, because your name was already here, waiting to be grown. Then the mist closed in again, and the shape was gone, leaving only the sound of its not-quite footsteps fading into the distance. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the impossible garden grow around my name. Hours, maybe. Long enough for the sun to rise and burn away the mist, revealing the moor in stark daylight. Long enough to see that the garden was already beginning to fade, the unnatural green slowly browning at the edges. By the time I finally stood to leave, only the faintest outline of my name remained, visible more as a depression in the earth than actual growth. The flowers were gone. The geometric patterns dissolved back into ordinary moorland. Even the stones I'd so carefully arranged were scattered, as if they'd never been moved at all. Only the rabbit's skull remained, white and clean, staring north with empty sockets that seemed to follow me as I walked away. I've been back to that spot a dozen times since then. Sometimes I find ordinary moor, heather and gorse, and the occasional sheep. Sometimes there are stones arranged in patterns I don't remember making. Once I found my initials traced in morning dew that shouldn't have formed on such a dry day. My therapist says I'm making progress, that the walks are helping with my depression. She's pleased that I've found what she calls a sense of purpose in my daily routine. She doesn't ask why I always walk in the same direction, or why I sometimes come back with dirt under my fingernails and moss stains on my clothes. The shapes in the mist haven't returned, at least not in any form I can see clearly. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the light falls at a certain angle across the moor, I catch glimpses of movement that doesn't quite belong to this world. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I catch the faint scent of tiny white flowers that exist only in impossible gardens. I still don't know if what I saw was real, or just another symptom of a mind struggling to find meaning in chaos. The rational part of me insists it was a hallucination, a beautiful delusion born from isolation and depression and too much time alone with my thoughts. But every morning, I check my shoes for moss stains. And every evening, I dream of gardens where my name grows in living letters, tended by things that may or may not exist, in a place that may or may not be real. The compass points north, always north, towards something I can't name but somehow understand. And I follow its direction, one step at a time, deeper into the moor where the impossible waits patiently to be discovered again. Story 4. The first thing you need to understand about pushing a locomotive through Milliken's Tunnel is that the darkness swallows sound differently than anywhere else. Not quieter, different. Every clank of metal against stone echoes back as something else entirely, something that makes your skin crawl even when you know it's just physics playing tricks. I'd been working the Richmond and Petersburg line for 3 years when they assigned me to move the old number 47 through the tunnel for restoration. Civil War-era engine, built in 1863, still bore the faded Confederate battle flag painted on her boiler. Most of the crew called her cursed, but I figured that was just superstition bred from too many late shifts and too much whiskey. Railroad men are notorious for their ghost stories. The tunnel itself stretched nearly a mile through solid granite, carved by hand during the 1850s using mostly slave labor. The company never talked about that part of its history, but you could feel it in the stones. Generations of suffering pressed into every inch of rock. The walls wept constantly, moisture that tasted of iron, and something else I couldn't name. I was about halfway through when I first heard the banging. 3 sharp raps against the roof of the cab, deliberate and rhythmic. I stopped the engine immediately, killed the steam, and listened. The silence that followed felt alive, breathing around me in the thick darkness beyond my headlamp's reach. I called out, asked if anyone was there, but the tunnel swallowed my voice without even bothering to echo it back. That's when I smelled the burning wood. Not fresh fire, old smoke, the kind that soaks into grain and never leaves. Sweet and acrid at the same time, with undertones of something organic that made my stomach turn. I checked every gauge, every connection, anything that might be overheating, but number 47 was running cold and clean. The smell seemed to be coming from outside, drifting in through the open cab windows like fog. I should have backed out then, should have radioed for another crew, claimed mechanical failure, anything to get out of that tunnel. Instead, I released the brake and pushed forward, telling myself it was probably just residual smoke from some hobo's cooking fire echoing through the ventilation shafts. The banging came again 15 minutes later. This time it wasn't 3 raps. It was a continuous drumming, like someone running alongside the locomotive and pounding the roof with their fists. I throttled up, thinking speed might help, but the sound kept pace perfectly. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I stopped, it stopped. But in the silence after, I heard footsteps. Heavy boots on gravel circling the engine. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched on stones that shouldn't have been there. The tunnel floor was solid granite, polished smooth by a century of trains. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned out of the cab, sweeping the beam across the tunnel walls. That's when I saw him. A figure standing maybe 30 feet away, holding a lantern that cast no light I could see. The shadow he threw stretched up the tunnel wall impossibly tall, flickering and dancing despite the fact that his lantern flame appeared perfectly still. I couldn't make out his face. It was hidden beneath the brim of what looked like a Civil War-era kepi, the kind Confederate officers wore. I called out to him, asked what he was doing down here, but he didn't respond. Instead, he raised his lantern higher, and suddenly the tunnel wall behind him was covered with moving shadows. Dozens of them, like a crowd of people I couldn't see casting silhouettes I could. The smell of burning wood grew stronger, and I realized it wasn't just wood. There was cloth in there too, and leather, and something else that made my throat close up. I'd smelled it once before, during a house fire on the outskirts of town, the smell of skin and hair catching flame. I ducked back into the cab and gunned the engine, desperate to get past whatever was happening behind me. But as number 47 lurched forward, I felt resistance, like we were pulling something heavy. The drive wheels spun against the rails, throwing sparks that illuminated the tunnel walls in brief strobing flashes. In those momentary bursts of light, I saw them clearly. Handprints. Hundreds of them, pressed into the stone as if the walls were soft clay. Some were small, delicate, others broad and calloused. All of them looked fresh, the stone around them still damp as if the hands had just pulled away. And they were moving, slowly, steadily, reaching toward the locomotive like they were trying to grab hold. The Confederate battle flag painted on number 47's boiler was changing too. The colors were brighter now, the paint wet and gleaming as if it had just been applied. But it wasn't just paint anymore. The red stripes were actually red, the kind of deep crimson that only comes from one source. And there were fingerprints in it, dozens of them, overlapping and smearing as if invisible hands were constantly touching the surface. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have been. But instead, I felt a strange sense of recognition, like I'd been expecting this all along. The thought disturbed me more than anything else that had happened. Why wasn't I more afraid? The answer came with another memory that felt like it belonged to someone else, standing in this same tunnel, but not as an engineer, wearing different clothes, holding different tools. The walls around me weren't carved yet, just raw granite waiting to be broken. There were others with me, dozens of men with dark skin and bent backs, their hands already bloody from the work. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the images, but they persisted. I could feel the weight of shackles on my wrists, taste the dust and desperation in the air, could hear the crack of whips and the groans of men pushed beyond their limits, could smell the smoke from the overseer's cigars mixing with the sweat and fear of the workers. But that was impossible. I was white, born in 1985, 3 generations removed from anything resembling the antebellum South. These weren't my memories. Were they? The locomotive shuddered to a stop, and I realized I'd been unconsciously applying the brakes. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete it felt like being buried alive. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, distant. Then I heard the voice. It was barely a whisper, so quiet I might have imagined it, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself. It spoke a single word in a dialect I didn't recognize but somehow understood perfectly. Home. The lantern bearer was closer now, close enough that I should have been able to see his face, but shadows clung to his features like they were protecting him from my gaze. He raised one hand, a hand that looked wrong somehow, too dark for the pale wrist that disappeared into his sleeve, and pointed directly at me. The handprints on the tunnel walls were reaching now, stretching toward number 47 with desperate urgency. Some of them were leaving the stone entirely, becoming three-dimensional, grasping at the air. The locomotive rocked slightly, as if invisible hands were trying to climb aboard. I fumbled for the radio, desperate to call for help, but when I keyed the microphone, all that came through was static mixed with what sounded like voices. Dozens of them, all talking at once in languages I couldn't identify. Some were singing work songs I'd never heard, but somehow knew every word to. Others were crying out names, calling for families they'd been separated from. The Confederate flag on the boiler was fully animated now, rippling in a wind I couldn't feel. The red stripes pulsed like arteries, and I could swear I saw faces in the pattern. Anguished expressions that appeared for a moment before being absorbed back into the design. That's when I noticed my hands. They were darker than they should have been, darker than they'd been that morning when I'd clocked in. The backs were crisscrossed with scars I didn't remember getting, and my palms were thick with calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard labor I'd never done. When I looked up at the cab windows, my reflection showed a face I almost recognized, my own features but aged by suffering I'd never experienced. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Come home. I understood then, with a clarity that bypassed logic entirely. This wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. This was an invitation, a completion of something that had been left unfinished over a century ago. The men who had carved this tunnel, who had died creating a passage they would never be allowed to travel, were still here, still working, still waiting, and somehow, impossibly, I was one of them. The lantern bearer lowered his arm and began walking toward the locomotive. With each step, more figures appeared behind him, shadows that gradually took shape, becoming men in torn clothes with chains around their ankles. They moved with purpose, converging on number 47 from all directions. I should have run. Should have abandoned the engine and sprinted toward either end of the tunnel. But my feet wouldn't move, and part of me, the part that remembered the weight of shackles and the taste of desperation, didn't want to leave. The first shadow reached the locomotive and placed his hand on the side. Where he touched, the paint began to change, the Confederate battle flag fading to be replaced by something else. Names, hundreds of them, carved into the metal as if it were soft wood. Names of men who had never been remembered, never been mourned, never been acknowledged for the work they'd done and the lives they'd lost. More hands joined the first, covering every inch of number 47's surface with names and dates and final words that had never been spoken aloud. The locomotive groaned under the weight of all that history, all that pain, but it didn't break. Instead, it seemed to settle, like it was finally carrying the load it had been meant to bear all along. The lantern bearer reached the cab and looked up at me. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze like a physical weight. He extended one hand toward me, palm up, waiting. I stared at that hand for what felt like hours, understanding that taking it would mean accepting something I couldn't fully comprehend. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings. This was a hallucination, a breakdown, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty engine. I needed medical help, not mystical experiences. But the other part of me, the part that remembered things I'd never experienced, recognized the truth. Some debts transcend death. Some work remains unfinished long after the workers have been forgotten. And sometimes, the only way to move forward is to first go back and set things right. I reached toward the offered hand, my fingers trembling with exhaustion I couldn't explain. Just before our skin touched, the lantern bearer spoke again, his voice clear and unmistakable despite the shadows hiding his face. "Thank you for coming back." The tunnel lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard the sound of chains breaking, one link at a time, until the air rang with the music of freedom finally achieved. When the emergency crews found me 3 hours later, I was sitting in the cab of number 47, staring straight ahead, with what they described as a 1,000-yard stare. The locomotive had somehow moved the remaining half-mile through the tunnel despite the fact that the boiler was cold and there was no pressure in the system. They said I was in shock, probably from carbon monoxide exposure, though the levels they measured didn't support that theory. The company doctor prescribed rest and counseling, and after a few weeks I was cleared to return to work. But I never went back to Milliken's Tunnel. Not because I was afraid. I wasn't. Not anymore. The fear had been replaced by something else, something that felt like completion mixed with profound sadness. I understood now why the other engineers called number 47 cursed. She wasn't cursed, exactly. She was just carrying passengers no one else could see. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if I really experienced any of it. The official report blamed the incident on fatigue and possible hallucinations caused by extended exposure to diesel fumes. The company sealed the tunnel permanently 6 months later, citing structural concerns, though the engineers who examined it said the granite was as solid as the day it was carved. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. And most importantly, I know what I remembered. Memories that belonged to someone else, but somehow felt like mine. The scar on my palm, the one that appeared after that night and never faded, suggests it wasn't entirely in my head. It's shaped like a chain link, perfectly formed, as if it had been pressed into my skin while the metal was still hot. I've never told anyone about that scar, just like I've never told anyone about the dreams that started afterward, dreams where I'm standing in an unfinished tunnel, holding tools I've never used, working alongside men whose names I somehow know, despite never having met them. In those dreams, we're not building a passage for trains. We're building something else entirely, a bridge between the world of the living and the place where unfinished business waits to be resolved. And every night we get a little closer to completing our work. The strange thing is, I'm not disturbed by these dreams. If anything, they feel like the most honest part of my existence, more real than my waking hours spent pretending that some experiences can be explained away by logic and medical terminology. Because the truth is, I think I did go home that night in the tunnel. I just haven't figured out yet whether I ever really left. Story 5. The truck's engine died with a metallic shudder, leaving me surrounded by the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I'd been driving for 6 hours through increasingly dense pine forests, following logging roads that seemed to narrow with each mile, until I wasn't entirely certain I was still on the right path. The GPS had given up an hour ago, displaying nothing but a blank green screen where the map should have been. But there it was, the hunting camp my brother had described, nestled in a clearing where the late afternoon light filtered through towering pines like amber honey. The cabin looked exactly as he'd said it would. Weathered logs, green metal roof, stone chimney already sending up a thin ribbon of smoke against the darkening sky. Someone had arrived before me. I grabbed my duffel bag and rifle case from the truck bed, my boots crunching on pine needles thick as carpet. The air carried that sharp, clean scent of resin and decomposing undergrowth that you only find deep in old forests. But underneath it, something else lingered, something metallic and organic that made my nostrils flare instinctively. That's when I saw them. 3 massive logs had been arranged in the clearing between my truck and the cabin, positioned in what could only be described as inverted bonfires. Instead of flames reaching skyward, each log supported freshly stripped animal pelts that hung like grotesque banners. The hides dripped steadily, creating dark patches in the pine needles below, but the liquid catching the dying light wasn't blood. It was thick, amber pine resin, oozing from the wood and coating the pelts in a sticky, preserving glaze. The sight stopped me cold. This wasn't how you processed game. This wasn't how anyone processed game. The pelts looked too fresh, too carefully arranged, as if they'd been placed there for display rather than practical purposes. Deer, maybe rabbit. It was hard to tell with the way they hung, shapeless and dark in the fading light. I approached slowly, my boots seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. The resin dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop hitting the forest floor with a soft pat that seemed to echo longer than it should. Up close, I could see that the logs had been deliberately scored, cut in precise patterns that channeled the flowing sap directly onto the hanging pelts. Someone had spent considerable time and thought creating this arrangement. The metallic scent grew stronger. Not blood exactly, but something similar. The smell of raw flesh and exposed bone that hunters know well. My throat tightened involuntarily. A door slammed somewhere behind me. I spun around to see a figure emerging from the cabin's front porch, silhouetted against the warm glow spilling from the windows. Even in the dim light, I could make out broad shoulders and the easy gait of someone comfortable in the wilderness. Relief flooded through me, my brother's hunting buddy no doubt setting up camp early. The figure raised a hand in greeting but said nothing, disappearing around the side of the cabin before I could call out. I waited for him to reappear, to introduce himself, or at least acknowledge my presence properly. But the only sounds were the steady drip of resin and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. I hefted my bags and headed for the cabin, giving the dripping pelts a wide berth. The porch steps creaked under my weight, and I knocked twice on the heavy wooden door before pushing it open. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a hunting cabin. Rough-hewn furniture, mounted deer heads, a fieldstone fireplace crackling with fresh logs, but it was empty. My voice echoed off the log walls when I called out a greeting. No response. I checked the single bedroom, the small kitchen, even the bathroom. Nobody. But someone had clearly been here recently. The fire was freshly built, coffee still warm in a pot on the propane stove, and wet boots sat beside the door, still gleaming with moisture. I set my gear in the corner and walked back outside, scanning the tree line. The figure I'd seen had to be somewhere nearby, probably checking snares or gathering firewood. But the forest remained still, holding its breath in that particular way wilderness does when you're being watched. The temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath starting to mist, and the resin dripping from the pelts had begun to slow, thickening in the cold. I decided to wait inside where it was warm, figuring whoever belonged to those wet boots would return eventually. But as full darkness settled over the clearing, no one came. I made myself dinner from the supplies I'd brought, trying to ignore the way the cabin's windows reflected the clearing behind me, turning the glass into black mirrors that seemed to watch my every movement. The silence outside was absolute now. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, nothing but the occasional pop and hiss from the fireplace. Around 11, I gave up waiting and prepared for bed. The bedroom contained 2 narrow bunks, and I chose the one farthest from the window, though I couldn't explain why. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of amber liquid and shapeless forms hanging in darkness. I woke to whistling. The sound drifted through the cabin walls like smoke, barely audible but unmistakably there. A slow, mournful melody that seemed familiar, but remained just beyond recognition. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to place the tune. It had the cadence of a hymn, something you might hear in a country church, but there was something wrong with the rhythm, as if whoever was whistling couldn't quite remember how the song was supposed to go. The luminous hands of my watch showed 3:17 a.m. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window, keeping low to avoid being seen. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, the 3 log arrangements casting long shadows across the pine needle carpet. The pelts hung motionless in the still air, but something about them had changed. They seemed darker, more substantial, as if they'd absorbed moisture from the night air and swollen like sponges. The whistling continued, floating from somewhere in the tree line to my left. Now that I was fully awake, I could make out more of the melody. Definitely a hymn. Something about redemption and salvation, but played at half speed and missing notes in a way that made my skin crawl. Whoever was out there had been whistling for a while. The song had that endless, circular quality of someone lost in repetition. Then came the crackling. It started soft, like kindling catching fire, but there was no orange glow in the darkness, no smell of smoke. The sound was dry and organic, like branches snapping underfoot, or my stomach lurched as recognition hit. That wasn't wood crackling. That was the sound of bones, old and brittle, being bent past their breaking point. The noise came in rhythmic bursts, as if someone were systematically working their way through a pile of skeletal remains, testing each piece until it snapped. The whistling never stopped, weaving around the crackling like a twisted lullaby. I pressed myself against the wall beside the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden, to wait until morning, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part of my mind, the rational part that insisted there had to be a logical explanation, urged me to investigate. Maybe someone was processing a recent kill, breaking bones to extract marrow. Maybe the whistling was just a way to pass time during tedious work. There were a dozen reasonable explanations that didn't involve anything supernatural or threatening. But reasonable explanations didn't account for the way the sound seemed to move through the forest, circling the clearing in a slow, deliberate pattern. And they certainly didn't explain why every fiber of my being was telling me to run. I grabbed my jacket and boots, moving as quietly as possible. The front door opened without a sound, and I stepped onto the porch, staying in the shadows. The clearing looked different at night, larger somehow, as if the darkness had expanded the space beyond its daytime boundaries. The 3 log arrangements stood like sentinels, their burden of pelt swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The whistling was clearer now, coming from my right instead of left. It had moved, or I'd been wrong about its location. The melody had shifted too, becoming more complex, adding harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a single person. But there was still only one whistler, I was certain of that. The sound had a singular quality, as if it came from one throat, one set of lungs working overtime to produce impossible music. The crackling had stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement in the forest. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant drip of cooling resin and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then, just as I was beginning to think the mysterious presence had moved on, I heard footsteps. They were careful, deliberate, circling the clearing at a distance that kept them hidden in the tree line. But in the perfect stillness of the night, each footfall was audible, the soft crush of pine needles, the occasional snap of a twig, the rhythmic pattern of someone moving with purpose. The footsteps stopped directly across from where I stood. I could feel eyes on me, studying my silhouette against the cabin's darker bulk. The sensation was so strong it was almost physical, like fingers tracing the outline of my body. But when I squinted into the darkness between the trees, I could see nothing but shadow layered upon shadow. The whistling resumed, softer now, almost intimate, as if the mysterious figure were humming just for me. The melody had become something I almost recognized, a hymn my grandmother used to sing while hanging laundry, something about walking through valleys and fearing no evil. But the tune was wrong, inverted somehow, as if it were being played backward or reflected through a broken mirror. Then I realized what had been bothering me about the hanging pelts. They were facing the wrong direction. Animal hides, when hung for processing, are typically suspended by the head or tail end, positioned for easy access to the areas that need work. But these pelts hung like clothes on a line, spread wide and displayed rather than arranged for function. And now, in the moonlight, I could see that they weren't random animal shapes at all. They were arranged in human proportions. My breath caught in my throat. The realization should have sent me running back into the cabin, should have had me grabbing my keys and fleeing into the night. But instead, I found myself stepping off the porch, drawn toward the nearest log arrangement by a compulsion I couldn't explain. Up close, the truth was undeniable. These weren't deer hides or rabbit pelts. The proportions were wrong, the size too large, the shape too familiar. And the resin coating them wasn't just preserving the material, it was transforming it, giving it a translucent quality that revealed darker shapes beneath the surface. The whistling stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and irregular, and the rapid whisper of my breathing. But underneath those familiar sounds, something else was audible, a wet, rhythmic noise that seemed to come from the pelts themselves. They were breathing. The resin-coated surfaces rose and fell in shallow, labored gasps, as if whatever lay beneath was struggling to draw air through the amber coating. I stumbled backward, my rational mind reeling, trying to find some explanation that didn't involve the impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. The pelts were alive, or contained something alive, something that had been preserved rather than killed. A hand touched my shoulder. I spun around to find myself face to face with the figure I'd seen earlier, though in the moonlight he looked different. Taller, more angular, with shadows where his features should have been. His mouth was moving in the pattern of the whistled hymn, but no sound emerged. Instead, the melody seemed to come from the forest itself, as if every tree and stone were participating in the twisted song. He gestured toward the cabin with one long arm, his movements fluid and wrong, like someone learning to operate an unfamiliar body. When he opened his mouth to speak, no words came out, just a soft exhalation that smelled of pine resin and old bones. I understood somehow that he wanted to show me something. Against every instinct, I followed him back toward the cabin. But instead of going inside, he led me around to the back, where a fourth log arrangement waited in the shadows. This one was different, larger, more elaborate, with multiple pelts layered in complex patterns. And at its base, wet boots that looked exactly like the ones I'd seen by the front door, exactly like the ones I was wearing. The figure turned to face me, and in the shifting moonlight, I caught a glimpse of his features. They were my own. My face, my expressions, my eyes reflecting the same confusion and growing horror that I felt. But there was something else there too, something older and more patient, as if this version of myself had been waiting a very long time for this moment. He raised one finger to his lips in a gesture for silence, then pointed to the layered pelts at the base of the log. I followed his gaze and saw, with a clarity that made my knees weak, the truth of what I was looking at. They were all me, layer upon layer of myself, each one slightly different, each one preserved at the moment of discovery. Some showed expressions of terror, others confusion, a few seemed almost peaceful. But they were all unmistakably my face, my body, my hands reaching out in futile gestures of denial or escape. The whistling resumed, coming from my own throat now, though I had no memory of starting the song. The melody was familiar because I'd been whistling it myself, standing in this same spot, making this same discovery, over and over and over. The figure smiled with my face and began to fade, becoming translucent like the resin-coated pelts. But before he disappeared entirely, he leaned close and whispered in my own voice, "Welcome back." I found myself standing beside my truck, keys in my hand, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The morning sun was streaming through the pines, and the clearing looked exactly as it had the previous evening. 3 log arrangements, fresh pelts dripping resin, the scent of pine and something metallic hanging in the air. The cabin door stood open, and I could see wet boots beside the entrance. My wet boots. I looked down at my feet and saw that I was wearing the same boots, but they were dry and had been for hours. Yet somehow I knew that if I walked over to the cabin, I would find them there too, still gleaming with moisture from a morning that I couldn't remember experiencing. The whistling started again, faint and far away, playing a hymn about redemption and salvation. But this time, I realized I could hear the crackling too, the sound of old bones breaking, somewhere in the distance, getting closer with each passing moment. I got in my truck and drove away, but I knew I would be back. I'm always back. Story 6. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was just the fog rolling in from the marsh. October nights in Louisiana carry strange vapors, thick as cotton and twice as suffocating. But fog doesn't smell like freshly sheared copper pipes, and it sure as hell doesn't make my German Shepherd Rex plant his 100-pound frame like he's facing down a rattlesnake. I'd been living in the old Thibodeau place for 3 months when the motion sensor started acting up. The spotlight would trigger at odd hours, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, casting its harsh beam across the backyard where nothing moved except Spanish moss, swaying in air that felt too still. The real estate agent had mentioned the previous owner's obsession with security, explaining the scattered floodlights and motion sensors like Christmas decorations gone wrong. What she hadn't mentioned was how the sensors seemed to have a life of their own. The night everything changed started like any other. Rex's low growl pulled me from a restless sleep, the kind of rumbling that vibrated through the floorboards and settled in my bones. I'd learned to trust that growl over the years. It had warned me about black ice on rural highways and sketchy characters lurking in gas station parking lots. Now it was telling me something was wrong in my own backyard. I padded barefoot to the kitchen window, Rex's nails clicking against hardwood as he followed. The yard lay in perfect darkness, shadows merging with shadows until the property line disappeared into something that looked less like landscape and more like the inside of a coal mine. Then the sensor tripped. The spotlight exploded to life with the intensity of a small sun, and instead of illuminating my modest patch of Louisiana dirt, it revealed nothing but dense, rolling fog. Not the wispy tendrils I'd grown accustomed to, but a solid wall of vapor that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The smell hit me through the screen door, metallic and sharp, like breathing in a handful of pennies. It coated my throat and made my sinuses burn. Rex's reaction was immediate and visceral. His hackles rose in a perfect ridge along his spine, and he backed away from the door with his ears pinned flat against his skull. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth I'd rarely seen him bare, even during his encounters with territorial possums. The growl that emerged from his chest was lower than I'd ever heard, more felt than heard. The spotlight held for exactly 37 seconds. I counted them, unable to look away from the impossible thickness of that fog. Then it died, plunging us back into absolute darkness that seemed deeper than before, as if the light had somehow subtracted illumination from the world rather than adding it. I stood at the window for another hour, Rex pressed against my legs like he was trying to push me away from the glass. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Even the usual chorus of crickets and tree frogs had gone silent, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. Sleep came fitfully, populated by dreams of copper pennies dissolving on my tongue and fog that moved like something living. The next morning brought brutal sunshine and the kind of humidity that makes shirts stick to skin within minutes of stepping outside. I walked the perimeter of the yard, Rex trailing behind me at a distance that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The grass showed no signs of unusual moisture, no lingering scent of metal, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. But something had changed in the way Rex moved through the space. He avoided the area directly under the spotlight, making wide circles around it like it radiated some invisible threat. When I called him closer to investigate a spot where the ground looked slightly disturbed, he sat down 20 feet away and refused to budge. The disturbance was subtle, a slight depression in the earth that could have been caused by a heavy rain, except we hadn't had rain in 6 days. The soil felt different beneath my fingers, softer somehow, as if it had been recently turned. There was an oily quality to it that left residue on my hands even after wiping them on my jeans. That evening, I positioned myself in the kitchen before midnight, armed with a cup of coffee and a determination to solve the mystery. Rex had taken up residence in the living room, as far from the back door as he could manage while still keeping me in sight. The subtle whining that emerged from his throat every few minutes suggested he knew something I didn't and desperately wanted to communicate it. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I watched the digital clock on the microwave count down the minutes, each glowing number seeming to take longer to change than the last. My coffee grew cold, then room temperature, then slightly warm again from my hands wrapped around the mug. At 2:47 a.m., Rex's whining stopped. The silence was sudden and complete, as if someone had thrown a switch that controlled every living thing within a 5-mile radius. Even the ancient refrigerator seemed to hold its breath. Rex's body had gone rigid, every muscle tensed like a spring wound too tight. The motion sensor triggered. This time, I was ready. I pressed my face against the screen door, breathing in that metallic smell that hit like a physical blow. The fog was thicker than before, almost solid in its density. It moved with purpose, flowing in directions that defied the still air. Shapes seemed to form within it, suggestions of movement that could have been debris caught in unexpected currents, or could have been something else entirely. Rex began to tremble. His powerful frame shook like he was standing in a blizzard, and a sound emerged from his throat that I'd never heard before. Part whine, part keen, all terror. He backed away from me, from the door, from whatever waited in that impossible fog. The spotlight died. In the sudden darkness, I heard something I shouldn't have been able to hear. The sound of liquid moving, thick and viscous, like syrup being poured from a great height. It came from the direction of the spotlight, accompanied by a subtle squelching that made my stomach clench. I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the kitchen with harsh fluorescent glare that seemed pathetic after the intensity of the spotlight. Rex had retreated to the hallway, pressing himself against the wall like he was trying to become part of it. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside with the kind of dread usually reserved for opening medical test results. The yard looked normal in the gentle morning light. Green grass, scattered leaves, the faithful old live oak that provided shade in the brutal summer months, except for the area directly beneath the spotlight. The ground was soft there, churned up as if someone had been digging with their hands. But it wasn't just disturbed soil. It was mud. Rich, black mud that squelched beneath my shoes and clung to the rubber soles with disturbing persistence. The smell was wrong too, carrying undertones of rust and something organic that made my throat close up. I walked to the edge of the property where my car sat in the carport, thinking maybe I could get some perspective on the situation. Some distance, maybe drive into town and talk to someone, though I wasn't sure what I'd say. The car wouldn't start, not because of mechanical failure, but because the front wheels had sunk into mud that hadn't existed when I'd parked the night before. Thick black mud that came up to the wheel wells and held the car like it was embedded in concrete. The same mud, with the same wrong smell and the same impossible existence. I stood there for a long time, staring at my trapped car and trying to process what I was seeing. Rex watched from the kitchen window, his expression somehow conveying both sympathy and accusation, as if he blamed me for not listening to his warnings, for dismissing his terror as simple canine nerves. The mud hadn't been there 30 minutes earlier when I'd first stepped outside. That night I tried to stay awake. I positioned myself in the living room with all the lights on, Rex curled up beside me in a way that suggested he'd appointed himself my bodyguard. But exhaustion won out somewhere around midnight, and I woke to the sound of Rex barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something raw and desperate. The spotlight was on. I could see its glow reflecting off the kitchen walls, painting everything in harsh white and shadow. The metallic smell had grown stronger, permeating the house now despite closed doors and windows. It coated everything, the inside of my mouth, my sinuses, even seeming to settle on my skin like an oily film. Rex had positioned himself between me and the kitchen, his stance wide and protective. When I tried to move toward the window, he blocked me with his body, pressing against my legs with enough force to make me stumble. But I had to see. I pushed past him, ignoring his increasingly frantic whines, and made it to the kitchen window just as the spotlight died. In that last second of illumination, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The fog wasn't just thick, it was occupied. Shapes moved within it, tall and angular, casting shadows that didn't match their positions relative to the light. They moved with purpose, with intelligence, as if they were searching for something, or someone. The darkness that followed seemed to press against the windows like a living thing. I could hear movement outside. Not footsteps exactly, but a sliding, dragging sound that circled the house. Rex had gone completely silent, his body pressed against mine as we both listened to whatever was exploring my property. When morning came, the mud had spread. What had started as a small patch beneath the spotlight now covered half the backyard, extending in organic tendrils that seemed to follow some pattern I couldn't discern. My car had sunk deeper, the mud now reaching the door handles. The smell was everywhere, clinging to my clothes and hair despite my not having left the house. I tried the landline. Dead. My cell phone showed no signal, though it had worked fine the day before. The isolation was complete and deliberate, as if something wanted to ensure I couldn't call for help. Rex had stopped eating. He spent his days pressed against the front windows, staring out at the street as if hoping someone would drive by and notice our predicament. His water bowl remained full, and treats that would normally disappear in seconds lay untouched on the kitchen floor. The nights grew worse. The spotlight began triggering multiple times, each activation revealing fog that grew thicker and more populated. The shapes within it became clearer, more defined, though I still couldn't quite make out what they were. They seemed to be getting closer to the house with each appearance, testing boundaries that I didn't understand. The mud continued to spread, following patterns that defied natural explanation. It flowed uphill in some places, pooled in perfect circles in others. When I watched carefully, I could see it move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving, like something alive. On the 7th night, Rex disappeared. I woke to silence, the complete absence of his breathing and restless movement. His bed in the corner of my room was empty, the blanket still warm but already cooling. The back door stood open, though I knew I'd locked it. I called his name into the darkness, my voice swallowed by air that felt thick as soup. The spotlight remained mercifully dark, but I could smell that metallic scent growing stronger by the minute. Somewhere out there, Rex was facing whatever had been circling us for days. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my bare feet immediately sinking into mud that hadn't been there at bedtime. The beam of my light seemed pathetic against the darkness, revealing only small circles of churned earth and Spanish moss that hung too still in air that should have been moving. Rex's tracks led toward the spotlight, clear paw prints in the mud that grew deeper and more frantic as they approached the base of the pole. Then they simply stopped, as if he'd been lifted straight up into the air. The motion sensor triggered. This time the fog didn't obscure everything, it revealed. Within its depths, shapes moved with perfect clarity now. Tall figures that walked upright but moved wrong, their limbs bending in directions that hurt to watch. And there, suspended somehow in the center of it all, was Rex. He hung motionless in the fog, his eyes open but unseeing, his body perfectly still as if time had stopped for him alone. The figures moved around him like he was part of some ritual I couldn't comprehend. I ran toward him, shouting his name, but the mud grabbed at my feet with each step, slowing me down until I was moving through what felt like quicksand. The metallic smell grew so strong it made me gag, and the fog began to swirl around me, thick as cotton and twice as suffocating. The spotlight died. In the darkness that followed, I heard Rex hit the ground with a wet thud. By the time I fumbled my way to where he'd fallen, he was gone again, leaving only a depression in the mud shaped like a large dog. I spent the rest of the night searching, calling his name until my voice gave out, but Rex was truly gone. When morning came, even his tracks had disappeared, smoothed over by mud that moved like something alive. Now I sit in my living room, all the lights on, waiting for sunset. The mud has reached the foundation of the house, and I can hear it moving beneath the floorboards like water seeking its own level. The metallic smell has become so strong that food tastes like pennies and my teeth ache from breathing it. The spotlight will activate again tonight. The fog will come, thicker than ever, and the shapes within it will be clearer still. They've been patient, testing boundaries, learning my routines. But patience has its limits, and I think tonight they've decided to stop waiting. I can hear Rex barking somewhere out there in the darkness, though I know that's impossible. The sound comes from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through air that feels too thick to breathe. He's trying to warn me about something, the same way he tried to warn me that first night when the fog appeared. Maybe I should have listened. The motion sensor just triggered, and I can smell that metallic scent growing stronger. The fog is rolling in, thick and purposeful, and somewhere within it, shapes are moving toward the house. Rex is still barking, though the sound is getting fainter. I think I understand now why the previous owner was so obsessed with security systems. He wasn't trying to keep people out. He was trying to keep something in. The spotlight just died, and the darkness that followed is absolute. But I can hear them moving outside, sliding through mud that exists only when they need it to exist, searching for a way inside. Rex has stopped barking. I think it's time to find out what they want. Story 7. The first thing I noticed about the boarding house wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the smell of decades-old cigarette smoke clinging to every surface. It wasn't even the way Mrs. Henley's eyes lingered on me just a moment too long when I handed her the security deposit. It was the rocking chair in the common room, positioned with its back to the television, facing nothing but the narrow hallway that led to the communal bathroom. I'd taken the room on the second floor out of desperation more than choice. 3 months behind on rent at my previous place, credit shot, and my savings account showing numbers that made my stomach clench. The boarding house on Maple Street wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it was clean enough, and more importantly, I could afford it. Mrs. Henley had shown me to my room with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before, rattling off rules about quiet hours and shared kitchen privileges, while I nodded and tried not to think about how far I'd fallen. The chair bothered me from day one, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Made of dark wood with worn velvet cushions, it sat perfectly still in the common room like a sentinel. During my first week, I'd attempted to move it, just a subtle adjustment so it faced the television like any normal piece of furniture should. But every morning, without fail, it had returned to its original position, back turned to the room, facing down that dim hallway. I asked Mrs. Henley about it on a Tuesday morning while she sorted mail in the entryway. She paused, her weathered fingers hovering over a stack of envelopes, and something shifted in her expression. "That chair's been here longer than I have," she said finally. "Previous owner left it. Said it belonged to her grandmother." She resumed sorting, but her movements had become more deliberate, more careful. Some things are better left as they are. The other residents seemed to accept the chair's presence with the same resigned familiarity they showed toward the temperamental heating system and the way the front door stuck in humid weather. There were 5 of us in total. Myself, an elderly man named Frank who worked nights at a warehouse, 2 women in their 40s who kept to themselves, and a younger guy named Derek who always smelled faintly of motor oil and rarely spoke to anyone. None of them sat in the chair. I began to notice this consciously after my second week, how we'd all congregate in the common room to watch the evening news or share awkward small talk. But that particular seat remained empty. We'd arrange ourselves on the sagging couch or bring in kitchen chairs, unconsciously forming a circle that excluded the rocking chair entirely. The bathroom situation took getting used to. One facility per floor, shared among us all, with a schedule posted on the door that everyone ignored. The lock was old and temperamental, requiring a specific jiggle and turn technique that took me several embarrassing encounters to master. The pipes groaned constantly, a symphony of metallic complaints that seemed to echo through the walls at all hours. It was during my third week that I first noticed the chair had moved. I'd stayed up late working on job applications, the glow of my laptop screen, the only light in the common room. When I finally closed it and stood to head upstairs, something felt wrong. The chair, which had always faced the hallway with steadfast determination, now pointed directly toward the bathroom door at the far end. I stood there in the darkness, staring at it, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Perhaps it had always been positioned at this slight angle, and I simply hadn't noticed. But deep in my chest, a cold certainty settled like a stone. The chair had turned. Sleep came fitfully that night. I found myself listening to the sounds of the old house settling, the whisper of wind through gaps in the window frames, the distant rumble of late-night traffic. But underneath it all, threading through the familiar nocturnal symphony, I heard something else, a faint creaking, rhythmic and soft, like someone gently rocking back and forth. Morning brought rational thought and embarrassment at my own paranoia. The chair sat in its usual position, back to the room, facing the hallway. I must have been more tired than I'd realized, my perception skewed by too much caffeine and job search stress. Over breakfast, instant coffee and stale cereal, I almost laughed at myself. But that evening, when I entered the common room to check the weather forecast, the chair was facing the bathroom door again. This time, I didn't second-guess myself. I walked over and examined it closely, noting the slight indentations in the carpet where its legs had rested in the original position. 4 perfect circles, still visible, proving that the chair had indeed moved. Mrs. Henley was in the kitchen when I found her, scrubbing dishes with the methodical intensity of someone trying to wear away stubborn stains. "The rocking chair," I began, but she cut me off without turning around. "Moves sometimes," she said simply. "Usually at night. Usually when someone new is getting settled." Her casual tone made the admission somehow more unsettling than if she'd seemed alarmed or surprised. This was simply a fact of life in the boarding house, apparently, like the broken step on the staircase or the way the radiators knocked when the heat kicked on. "Why?" I asked. She finally turned, drying her hands on a threadbare dish towel. Her eyes held that same careful quality I'd noticed before, as if she were choosing her words from a very specific vocabulary. "Some say it's looking for something. Others think it's keeping watch." She folded the towel with precise movements. "I just know better than to sit in it after dark." That night, I positioned myself in the common room with a book and a cup of tea, determined to witness whatever was happening. The chair sat in its usual spot, innocent and still. I read the same paragraph 4 times, my attention split between the words on the page and the peripheral monitoring of that dark wooden sentinel. Around 11:30, Frank shuffled through on his way to work, nodding at me with tired eyes before disappearing out the front door. The house settled into deeper quiet, the kind of silence that seems to press against your eardrums. I was beginning to think nothing would happen when I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible creak. I looked up from my book to find the chair rocking gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. But there was no one there. As I watched, frozen, the rocking gradually slowed and stopped. And in that moment of stillness, the chair began to turn. It wasn't a sudden movement, nothing dramatic enough to explain away as a trick of the light or tired eyes playing tricks. Instead, it rotated with deliberate slowness, like hands moving across a clock face. The process took perhaps 30 seconds, during which I sat transfixed, my book forgotten in my lap. When it stopped, the chair faced the bathroom door perfectly, as if drawn by some invisible magnetic force. I waited, hardly breathing, but nothing else happened. The chair simply sat there, its attention focused down the hallway with patient intensity. After another 20 minutes, I gathered my courage and approached it. The wood was warm to the touch, which shouldn't have been possible in the consistently cool common room. More disturbing was the faint indentation in the seat cushion, as if someone had recently been sitting there. The velvet held the suggestion of body heat, though no one had occupied the chair in my presence. I decided to test something. Gripping the chair by its arms, I carefully rotated it back to its original position, facing away from the bathroom. The wood seemed to resist slightly, like trying to turn a key that doesn't quite fit, but eventually it moved. Then I sat down. The sensation was immediate and profoundly wrong. The moment my body settled into the chair, a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt as though I were sharing the space with someone else, some presence that objected to my occupancy. The impression was so strong that I found myself leaning forward, as if making room for an invisible companion. But it was the pull I felt that truly disturbed me. A gentle but insistent tugging sensation, as if the chair wanted to turn again, to face the bathroom, and was trying to take me with it. I gripped the armrests and felt the subtle pressure continue, a mechanical yearning that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. I stood quickly, my heart hammering, and backed away from the chair. As soon as I was clear of it, the sensation vanished, leaving me shaky and confused. The chair remained in its adjusted position, but I could swear it radiated disappointment. That was the beginning of my real obsession with the bathroom at the end of the hall. I'd used it countless times since moving in, of course, but always with the practical mindedness of basic necessity. Now, knowing the chair's attention was focused on that particular door, I began to notice things I'd previously overlooked. The door itself was older than the others in the building, made of heavy wood with panels that had been painted over so many times that the details were softened and blurred. The lock mechanism was different too. Not the standard residential hardware found throughout the rest of the house, but something older, more elaborate, with decorative metalwork that suggested it had been salvaged from somewhere else. Inside, the bathroom was cramped but functional, with a pedestal sink, toilet, and narrow shower stall crammed into a space that felt like an afterthought. The mirror above the sink was silvered with age, creating distorted reflections that made everything look slightly warped. The tiles on the floor were small and hexagonal, many of them cracked or missing entirely, but it was the sink that drew my attention most forcefully. Made of white porcelain that had yellowed with age, it sat on a slender pedestal that looked too delicate to support its weight. The faucet was old-fashioned, with separate hot and cold taps that required significant effort to turn, but more than its appearance, it was the sink's behavior that began to unnerve me. Water pressure throughout the boarding house was inconsistent at best, ranging from a weak trickle to sudden violent bursts that could soak you if you weren't careful. But the bathroom sink seemed to follow its own rules entirely. Sometimes the water would run clear and steady. Other times it would sputter and cough, producing intermittent spurts of liquid that looked distinctly off color. I first noticed the dark water on a Thursday evening, nearly a month after moving in. I'd been brushing my teeth when the flow suddenly changed, becoming thick and murky, like water that had been sitting stagnant for weeks. The color was wrong, not the brown of rust or the black of sewage, but something in between, a shade that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Instinctively, I pulled my hands back from the stream, but not before a few drops hit my fingers. The sensation was immediate and deeply unpleasant. Not wetness exactly, but a tingling numbness that spread across my skin like Novocaine taking effect. The feeling persisted even after I'd dried my hands thoroughly, a persistent pins and needles sensation that took nearly an hour to fade completely. I mentioned it to Mrs. Henley the next morning, describing the discolored water and strange sensation. She listened with the same careful attention she'd shown when discussing the rocking chair. "Old pipes," she said finally. "Sometimes they get stirred up. Best not to let it touch you when it's running dark." Her matter-of-fact delivery should have been reassuring, but instead it reinforced the feeling that these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern I was only beginning to understand. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying closer attention to the bathroom's quirks. The dark water appeared irregularly, sometimes daily, sometimes not for several days in a row. But when it did come, it was always accompanied by that same numbing tingle, and increasingly, by sounds. At first, I thought the noises were simply the pipes settling or air trapped in the system, the kind of mechanical groans and gurgles that old plumbing produces. But as I listened more carefully, I began to detect something else, a rhythmic quality that sounded almost like chanting. The sounds were faint and seemed to come from deep within the walls, as if traveling up through the building's entire network of pipes from some distant source. I could never quite make out words, but there was a cadence to it, a rise and fall that suggested human voices engaged in some kind of ritual repetition. The first time I clearly heard what sounded like singing, I was washing my face before bed. The dark water had started flowing again, and I was careful to keep my hands well clear of the stream when the sound began. Low and mournful, it seemed to emanate not just from the pipes, but from the walls themselves, as if the entire bathroom had become a resonating chamber. I froze, water dripping from my chin, and listened intently. The melody was unfamiliar but strangely formal, with the structured quality of liturgical music. As I strained to hear more clearly, the singing seemed to grow stronger, more distinct, until I could almost convince myself I was hearing actual words. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt oppressive. Even the usual house sounds, the settling creaks, the whisper of air through vents, the distant hum of electrical appliances, seemed muted, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, before carefully backing out of the bathroom. As I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The soft sound of water dripping, even though I'd turned off both taps. I looked back at the sink. Both faucets were firmly closed, but dark water was falling from them in slow, measured drops, each one striking the porcelain with a sound like a metronome. The liquid didn't behave like normal water. Instead of splashing or running toward the drain, each drop seemed to hang on the surface for a moment before being absorbed, leaving behind faint stains that looked like old blood. That night I dreamed of churches. In the dream, I was standing in a vast cathedral filled with empty pews. The architecture was wrong somehow, with columns that twisted at impossible angles and stained glass windows that showed scenes I couldn't quite focus on. The altar at the far end seemed both infinitely distant and uncomfortably close, flickering between the two states like a broken film reel. But it was the sound that dominated the dream, hundreds of voices raised in harmony, singing a song I almost recognized but couldn't name. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time, filling me with a longing so intense it felt like grief. I woke with the taste of dark water in my mouth. The next few days passed in a haze of growing anxiety. I found myself avoiding the common room during the evening hours, unwilling to witness the chair's nightly rotation. But even from my room, I could sense its presence, could almost feel its patient attention focused on that bathroom door. My work search had stalled completely. I'd sit at my laptop for hours, staring at job listings without really seeing them, my mind occupied by the puzzle of the boarding house's peculiarities. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams of singing voices and dark water, of chairs that moved with purpose and mirrors that showed reflections that weren't quite right. It was Derek who finally broke my growing isolation. I encountered him in the kitchen one morning, making coffee with the methodical precision of someone operating on very little sleep. He looked as haggard as I felt, with dark circles under his eyes and the slightly disconnected expression of chronic insomnia. He glanced at me as I entered, and something in his face suggested recognition, not of me specifically, but of a shared experience. "You hear it too," he said quietly. I poured myself coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Hear what?" "The singing. At night, when the water runs dark." He leaned against the counter, cradling his mug like it was a source of warmth in a cold world. been going on for months now, ever since I moved into the room next to the bathroom. The relief I felt at this confirmation was overwhelming. I wasn't losing my mind, wasn't imagining the sounds or the strange behavior of the sink. Someone else had noticed. Someone else was experiencing the same phenomena. Derek continued, his voice barely above a whisper. At first I thought it was the radio in one of the other rooms, maybe picking up some religious station. But then I started paying attention to when it happened. Always at night, always when that chair is facing the bathroom, always when the water's running wrong. "What do you think it is?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers. "I think something happened in that bathroom a long time ago. Something that left an echo." "What kind of something?" "The kind of thing that makes a chair turn itself around every night to keep watch." That evening, I made a decision that I knew was probably unwise but felt necessary nonetheless. I was going to spend the night in the bathroom, to witness whatever was happening firsthand, instead of collecting second-hand accounts and fragmentary experiences. I waited until the house settled into its nighttime quiet, then gathered a pillow and blanket and made my way down the hall. The bathroom door seemed larger in the darkness, more imposing, and I had to force myself to turn the handle and step inside. The space felt different at night, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together while the sun was down. The mirror reflected my nervous face back at me in fragments, broken by the silvered spots and distortions of age. I spread my blanket on the floor in the corner farthest from the sink and settled in to wait. For the first hour, nothing happened. The bathroom remained silent except for the occasional settling sound from the pipes or the distant murmur of late-night traffic. I began to wonder if my presence was somehow interfering with whatever phenomena I'd come to observe, if the very act of watching prevented the watched from occurring. Then, around 2 a.m, I heard the familiar creak of the rocking chair. Even through the closed door and down the length of the hallway, the sound was unmistakable. The chair was moving, beginning its nightly rotation toward the bathroom, toward me. As if summoned by that sound, the pipes in the walls began to whisper. It started as a barely audible susurrus, like wind through leaves, but gradually grew more distinct. I could hear the movement of water through the building's circulatory system, but also something else, a rhythmic pulsing that sounded organic, almost like a heartbeat. The sink began to drip. I watched, transfixed, as dark water began to fall from both faucets in perfect synchronization. Each drop hung in the air for just a moment too long before striking the porcelain with a sound like a bell tolling. The liquid didn't run toward the drain but instead began to pool in the basin, forming a mirror dark surface that reflected nothing. And then, the singing began. It rose from the pipes like incense, filling the small bathroom with harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voices were human, but somehow more than human, carrying an emotional weight that bypassed rational thought and went straight to some deeper part of consciousness. I recognized it now, a Latin hymn, though not one I could name. The words were unclear, muffled by their passage through metal and mortar, but the intent was unmistakable. This was liturgical music, sacred song, the kind of devotional expression that belonged in cathedrals and monasteries. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl even as the beauty of the harmony moved me to tears. The voices carried an undertone of desperation, of souls caught between devotion and despair, and listening to them felt like eavesdropping on something private and profound and terrible. As the singing continued, the pool of dark water in the sink began to change. The surface, which had been smooth as glass, started to ripple with movement that came from within, rather than from any external disturbance. Shapes began to form in the liquid, indistinct at first, like faces seen through fog, but gradually becoming clearer. I saw them then, the singers. They moved within the dark water like figures trapped behind black glass, their mouths open in eternal song, their eyes closed in expressions of rapturous agony. Men and women both, dressed in robes that might have been white once but had been stained by whatever medium held them captive. Their faces were beautiful and terrible, marked by a holiness that had curdled into something else entirely. One of them opened her eyes and looked directly at me, The contact was electric, a connection that bypassed every rational defense I possessed. In her gaze, I saw centuries of longing, of devotion turned toxic, of souls who had sought transcendence and found themselves trapped in an endless loop of worship. She reached toward me through the dark water, her fingers breaking the surface tension, and I understood with absolute clarity that she wanted me to join them. I jerked backward, slamming into the bathroom door with force that rattled the entire frame. The impact broke whatever spell had held me, and I fumbled desperately with the old lock mechanism, my fingers clumsy with terror. Behind me, the singing grew louder, more insistent, as if the chorus sensed my attempt to escape and was trying to hold me with the sheer power of their voices. I could feel their attention like weight pressing against my back, could sense them rising within their liquid prison, reaching for me with hands that had been grasping for salvation for longer than I could comprehend. The lock finally gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping as if I'd been underwater myself. The singing followed me, echoing through the pipes in the walls, a sound that seemed to chase me down the corridor and up the stairs to my room. I slammed my door and turned the lock, then dragged my dresser in front of it for good measure. Only then did I allow myself to collapse, shaking uncontrollably as the full impact of what I'd witnessed hit me. But even in my room, I wasn't safe from the sound. It permeated the building now, rising from every drain and faucet, a chorus of the trapped and devoted that had found new strength in my acknowledgement of their existence. They sang until dawn, a ceaseless hymn that spoke of longing and loss, and the terrible price of seeking the divine in dark places. When morning finally came, the singing stopped abruptly, as if cut off by the first ray of sunlight, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound had been, pregnant with the promise of return. I packed my few belongings with hands that still trembled and left the boarding house before Mrs. Henley had risen for the day. I left my security deposit behind and didn't look back as I walked down Maple Street, carrying everything I owned in a single suitcase. But even now, months later, living in a studio apartment across town with plumbing that behaves exactly as plumbing should, I still hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the city settles into temporary quiet, I catch echoes of that sacred song drifting up from the pipes in my walls. It's fainter now, muffled by distance and different infrastructure, but it's there. They're still singing, still reaching through dark water toward anyone willing to listen. And sometimes, in the small hours before dawn, I find myself humming along, remembering the beauty hidden within their terrible devotion. The chair is still there, I'm sure, still turning each night to face the bathroom door, still keeping its patient vigil over whatever dwells within those pipes, still waiting for the next resident to discover that some thirsts can never be quenched, and some songs once heard can never truly end. I tell myself it was all in my head, a manifestation of stress and isolation and too many late nights in an unfamiliar place. But deep down, I know the truth. I touched something in that bathroom, something that had been singing in the darkness for longer than the building had existed, longer than the city itself had been more than a settlement on the river. And now they know I can hear them. Sometimes, when I'm brushing my teeth or washing my face, I see movement in my bathroom mirror that isn't quite my own reflection. Sometimes the water that comes from my faucets carries the faintest hint of that otherworldly tingle, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I hear a sound like wood creaking, as if somewhere in the city, a chair is turning slowly toward a door that should never be opened. But I don't go looking for it. I've learned that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened, and some songs better left unsung, even when they're the most beautiful music you've ever heard. Story 8. The footsteps always began at 3:17 in the morning. I'd grown accustomed to checking the luminous hands of my watch the moment consciousness clawed its way back through the fog of uneasy sleep. 3:17, without fail. The heavy boots would start their methodical march across the weathered planks of the veranda, each step a deliberate thud that seemed to shake the entire cabin, despite its sturdy construction. Back and forth, like a restless sentry walking his post. But they never passed the corner where the nautical buoy hung like some maritime talisman, its brass bell silent in the perpetually still air. I'd installed it there myself when I first rented this coastal retreat 6 weeks ago, thinking its weathered charm would complement the cabin's rustic aesthetic. The realtor had mentioned it came with the place, a genuine piece salvaged from a decommissioned lighthouse, she'd said with the kind of enthusiasm that should have warned me. Now lying in the darkness with my heart hammering against my ribs, I listened to those measured steps approach the corner, pause for exactly 7 seconds, then retreat. Always 7 seconds. I'd counted them so many times that the rhythm had become part of my internal clock, a metronome of dread that governed my sleepless nights. The sea breeze that should have carried the salt-sweet smell of the Atlantic through my open windows remained eerily absent. Not even the slightest stirring of air to rustle the dune grass or rattle the loose shingle I'd been meaning to repair. The weather reports consistently promised 15-knot winds from the southeast, but inside my little pocket of coastal Maine, the atmosphere hung as motionless as a photograph. I'd convinced myself that the footsteps belonged to some night fisherman walking the public access path that ran behind the cabin. Perhaps someone checking crab traps or preparing for an early morning launch. Reasonable explanations were my anchors in those early weeks, tethering me to sanity when the darkness seemed to press against the windows with unusual weight. But fishermen don't walk the same 20-foot stretch of deck for hours without purpose, and they certainly don't maintain such precise timing night after night. The sound of my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. Each exhale whistled slightly through my nose, a deviated septum courtesy of a childhood accident, creating a soundtrack that had once comforted me with its familiarity. Now it felt like a beacon, announcing my wakefulness to whatever walked above. By the 4th week, I'd started timing the episodes with increasing obsession. The footsteps would begin at 3:17 and continue until 4:43, when the first tentative hints of dawn began to gray the horizon. 1 hour and 26 minutes of methodical pacing, broken only by those 7-second pauses at the corner where the buoy hung. During daylight hours, I'd inspect the veranda for signs of wear. The deckboard showed the expected weathering from years of coastal exposure, but no unusual patterns of wear. No scuff marks or heel prints to indicate regular foot traffic. I'd even sprinkled flour across the planks one evening, expecting to find footprints the next morning. The flour remained undisturbed, forming the same smooth layer I'd applied, as if the air itself had been holding its breath all night. My sleep became increasingly fractured. Even on those rare nights when exhaustion claimed me before 3:17, I'd find myself surfacing from dreams at exactly the right moment, my subconscious apparently attuned to a schedule I couldn't understand. The footsteps would be there, waiting, as reliable as sunrise. I began leaving lights on throughout the cabin, telling myself it was for convenience during my frequent nocturnal wanderings to the bathroom or kitchen. The truth was that darkness had become synonymous with that measured pacing above, and I craved any illumination that might push back against the oppressive weight of night. The electricity bill would be astronomical, but I'd stopped caring about such mundane concerns. Food lost its appeal. I'd stare at perfectly prepared meals until they grew cold, my appetite dissolving the moment I remembered what awaited me after sunset. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the toll. Hollow cheeks, eyes ringed with shadows dark enough to suggest illness, a general gauntness that made my clothes hang loose. I looked like a man being slowly consumed from within. The isolation didn't help. I'd chosen this remote cabin specifically for its solitude, seeking respite from the demands of urban life and the suffocating expectations of a career that had gradually leached all joy from my existence. The nearest neighbors lived 2 miles up the coast, and the small town beyond them felt like another world entirely. I'd wanted silence and peace. Instead, I'd found a different kind of noise altogether. During my increasingly rare ventures into town for supplies, I'd catch myself studying the faces of the locals, searching for some sign that they knew about the cabin, about what walked its veranda in the hours before dawn. But their expressions revealed nothing except the polite disinterest typical of seasonal communities, where strangers came and went with the tides. The hardware store owner, a weathered man whose hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and marine varnish, had asked if I was settling in well. I'd almost told him about the footsteps, but something in his casual demeanor stopped me. How do you explain to someone that their peaceful coastal town harbors something that defies rational explanation? How do you describe the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, of sharing space with a presence that respects boundaries you can't see? Instead, I'd mumbled something about adjusting to the quiet and purchased a set of heavy-duty door locks that I had no intention of using. The locks now sat in their packaging on my kitchen counter, a monument to my own indecision. What was the point of securing doors against something that never attempted entry? But then came the morning when everything changed. I'd endured another sleepless night of pacing above, the footsteps maintaining their inexorable rhythm while I lay rigid beneath sheets soaked with nervous perspiration. The 7-second pauses seemed longer somehow, as if whatever walked there was listening more intently, paying closer attention to the sounds emanating from within. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the salt-stained windows, the footsteps ceased with their usual abruptness. I waited for the familiar silence that would signal the end of another episode, the return of normal morning sounds that never quite materialized in this pocket of perpetual stillness. Instead, I heard the bell, the nautical buoy's brass bell, hanging motionless in air that never stirred, began to ring from inside my kitchen. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Not the bright, sharp note you might expect from brass, but something deeper, more ominous, as if the metal had aged beyond its years and taken on darker properties. Each ring lasted exactly 3 seconds, followed by precisely 7 seconds of silence before the next chime, the same 7-second interval as those pauses in the footsteps above. I lay paralyzed in bed, every rational thought screaming that this was impossible. The buoy hung outside, suspended from the corner of the veranda by a heavy chain I'd checked and rechecked. It had never been inside the cabin, never even been removed from its mounting. I'd examined it closely enough to know every detail of its construction, the way the brass had developed a green patina in spots, the small dent near the base where something had struck it long ago, the manufacturer's mark stamped into the metal in letters too worn to read clearly. Yet the sound was definitely coming from my kitchen, as clear and present as if the buoy itself had somehow materialized there overnight. I forced myself to rise, my legs trembling with a combination of exhaustion and terror. The hardwood floors felt ice cold beneath my bare feet, and each step toward the kitchen seemed to require enormous effort, as if I were walking through water. The ringing continued with mechanical precision, never varying in pitch or duration, never showing any sign of stopping. The kitchen was empty. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my temples, and stared at a perfectly normal room bathed in the gray light of early morning. No buoy, no bell, no explanation for the sound that continued to fill the space with its ominous chiming. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. The coffee maker sat ready for brewing, its timer blinking the correct time. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it the night before, but the ringing continued. I moved through the kitchen like a man underwater, opening cabinets, checking behind appliances, searching for any possible source of the sound. My hands shook as I examined every surface, every corner, every shadow that might conceal some rational explanation. The chiming seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air had learned to sing with brass and sorrow. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the sound itself. I stood motionless in my kitchen, surrounded by the mundane artifacts of daily life, wondering if I'd finally crossed some invisible line between stress and madness. The absence of sound felt heavy, pregnant with implications I didn't want to consider. I returned to the veranda to check the buoy, knowing what I'd find but needing the confirmation anyway. It hung exactly where it had always hung, motionless in the still air, its brass surface already warming in the strengthening sunlight. When I reached up to examine it more closely, the metal was cold to the touch, so cold it almost burned my fingertips. No warmth from recent use, no vibration in the metal that might suggest it had been ringing moments before. But when I lifted the clapper and let it fall against the bell's interior, the sound that emerged was identical to what I'd heard in my kitchen. deep, resonant, carrying that same note of inexplicable dread that seemed to linger in the air long after the metal fell silent. The next night, the pattern changed. The footsteps began at their usual time, but now they were accompanied by a second sound, the soft scraping of something being dragged across the deck. Not heavy, not violent, but persistent, like someone pulling a length of rope or chain behind them as they walked. The scraping would pause during those 7-second intervals, then resume with the footsteps, creating a rhythm that was both familiar and utterly alien. I found myself counting the scrapes as obsessively as I'd once counted the steps. 23 scrapes from one end of the veranda to the corner where the buoy hung. 7 seconds of silence. 23 scrapes back to the starting point. The mathematics of it seemed important somehow, as if understanding the pattern might provide insight into whatever was orchestrating these nocturnal performances. And at dawn, the bell rang again from inside my kitchen. This time I forced myself to remain in the room while it chimed, determined to locate the source through sheer stubborn observation. I stood perfectly still, controlling even my breathing, and listened with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for medical diagnoses or mechanical troubleshooting. The sound definitely originated from within the kitchen, but it seemed to shift location with each ring. One chime would seem to come from near the sink, the next from the vicinity of the stove, the third from somewhere near the small breakfast table where I'd once imagined enjoying peaceful morning meals. The bell was moving through my kitchen, following some invisible path that made sense only to whatever carried it. By the 6th week, I'd stopped pretending that sleep was possible. I'd arranged my bedroom furniture so that I could lie in bed and maintain a clear view of both the veranda and the kitchen, though neither vantage point provided any useful information. The footsteps and scraping continued above while the bell rang below, 2 separate impossibilities occurring simultaneously in spaces that should have been empty. My journal entries from this period reveal a mind struggling to maintain some grip on rationality. I documented everything with scientific precision, times, durations, variations in sound, as if enough data might somehow transform the inexplicable into the merely unusual. I drew diagrams of the cabin's layout, measured distances, calculated angles, all in service of finding some logical framework that could accommodate what I was experiencing. But logic, I was beginning to understand, had abandoned this place long before my arrival. The isolation was wearing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd grown comfortable with solitude over the years, even preferred it to the constant demands of social interaction. But this was different. This was solitude with an audience, privacy invaded by something that watched and waited and walked above my head night after night. I felt observed even during daylight hours, as if whatever presence shared this space with me never truly departed, only retreated to some dimension just adjacent to normal reality. I started talking to myself, holding one-sided conversations that helped fill the oppressive quiet of daylight hours. I'd narrate my activities while preparing meals or reading, providing a soundtrack of human voice that pushed back against the unnatural silence. The sound of my own speech became a lifeline, proof that I still existed in a world where cause and effect maintained some semblance of meaning. But even my voice began to sound strange after a while, as if the air itself was changing the way sound traveled through it. Words seemed to hang in the atmosphere longer than they should, creating echoes where none should exist. Sometimes I'd catch the tail end of sentences I'd spoken hours earlier, ghostly repetitions that materialized from nowhere and dissolved back into silence. The morning routine of checking the veranda became increasingly surreal. Every inspection revealed the same pristine deck, the same undisturbed surfaces, the same nautical buoy hanging motionless in air that never stirred. Yet the sounds I heard each night were unmistakably those of heavy boots on wooden planks, accompanied by whatever was being dragged behind the unseen walker. I began to suspect that the cabin existed in multiple states simultaneously. One version where nothing unusual occurred, available for daylight inspection and rational analysis, and another where the laws of physics bent to accommodate impossible sounds and displaced objects. The question wasn't whether I was losing my mind, but whether my mind was the only thing capable of perceiving what was actually happening. The bell in my kitchen had become the most disturbing element of all. Unlike the footsteps, which at least maintained the pretense of occurring in a logical location, the ringing seemed to mock the very concept of physical space. I'd taken to placing objects throughout the kitchen each night: glasses of water that would reveal vibrations, sheets of paper that would flutter if disturbed by moving air, even a small digital recorder that I hoped might capture evidence of the phenomenon. Nothing was ever disturbed. The glasses sat perfectly still, their surfaces unbroken by even the smallest ripple. The papers remained exactly where I'd placed them. The recorder captured nothing but the ambient hum of electrical appliances and the distant crash of waves that I could never quite hear while actually in the cabin. Yet every morning at dawn, that brass voice would fill my kitchen with its inexorable chiming, each note precisely timed and perfectly pitched, as if performed by an invisible musician with supernatural patience. I'd stopped venturing into town altogether. The thought of human interaction had become almost unbearable, partly because I couldn't trust myself not to blurt out the truth about what was happening, and partly because other people now seemed impossibly foreign to me. How could they exist in a world where buoys stayed where they were hung, where footsteps left marks, where bells only rang when something struck them? Their casual normalcy felt like a rebuke to everything I'd experienced. The refrigerator had grown empty except for coffee and the occasional piece of fruit that I'd force myself to eat. Cooking required too much focus, too much time spent in the kitchen where that impossible ringing occurred each dawn. I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, and my clothes hung on my frame like a scarecrow's costume. But it was the dreams that finally convinced me that whatever was happening transcended simple psychological breakdown. I'd begun to dream of the cabin as it must have been years ago, decades perhaps, when the paint was fresh and the deck boards were new. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. A figure walked the veranda at night, but this time I could see him clearly. A man in a heavy coat, carrying something that scraped behind him as he paced. He was waiting for something, or someone, with the kind of patience that suggested eternity was just another word for Tuesday. In the dreams, I could see the nautical buoy swinging gently in a breeze that actually existed, its bell ringing softly with each movement. But the sound wasn't coming from the buoy at all. It was coming from inside the cabin, where another figure, this one barely visible, more suggestion than substance, moved through rooms that were simultaneously familiar and completely alien. When I woke from these dreams, usually just before 3:17, I'd carry with me the absolute certainty that I was experiencing not just the present moment, but layers of time that had somehow become permeable in this place. Past and present existed simultaneously here, separated by the thinnest of membranes that grew more transparent with each passing night. The footsteps weren't just echoes of something that had happened. They were something that was still happening, would always be happening, in a time that ran parallel to, but slightly offset from the one I normally inhabited. Last night, the pattern changed again. The footsteps began at 3:17 as always, but this time they were accompanied by a new sound. The soft rhythm of breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to sync with the pacing above, as if the unseen walker had suddenly acquired lungs to go with his boots. I lay rigid in my bed, hardly daring to breathe myself, listening to this respiratory soundtrack that made the presence above suddenly, terrifyingly personal. This wasn't just a recording or an echo anymore. This was something alive, something that drew air into its lungs and expelled it in measured cadences that spoke of consciousness and intent. And at dawn, when the bell began its ritual chiming in my kitchen, I heard something else underneath the brass notes. The same breathing, now coming from inside the cabin, moving through my space with the same measured rhythm that characterized everything else about this impossible situation. I write this as the sun sets on what I've decided will be my final night in this place. Tomorrow, I'll pack my few remaining possessions and return to the world where cause and effect still maintain their traditional relationship, where bells only ring when struck and footsteps leave actual impressions. But I know now that leaving won't end this. Whatever walks above and rings below has become part of me, woven into my perception in ways that distance won't unravel. I'll carry this place with me wherever I go, and in quiet moments, those spaces between sleep and waking, between thought and dream, I'll still hear those measured footsteps, still count those 7-second pauses, still wait for the morning bell that rings from spaces that can't possibly contain it. The question that haunts me isn't whether any of this actually happened. The question is whether it's still happening right now, in a cabin by the sea where the wind never blows and time moves in circles, where someone walks the same 20 feet of deck night after night, waiting for something that may have already arrived, but hasn't yet learned how to stay. Outside my window, the sun touches the horizon, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, I can already hear the whisper of boots on weathered wood, the soft scrape of something being dragged behind them, the patient breathing of whatever has been sharing this space with me all along. 3:17 is coming, and for the first time since this began, I find myself curious rather than terrified. Tonight, I think, I'm going to open the door. Story 9. The cabin greeted me with silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I dropped my duffel bag on the familiar hardwood floor, and the sound echoed through rooms that had known 3 generations of family gatherings. But something was wrong. The air hung thick and heavy, saturated with a sweetness that made my stomach turn, the unmistakable aroma of expensive cognac seeping from the ancient pine beams overhead. I'd arrived 2 days early to prepare for our annual reunion, a tradition that had survived marriages, divorces, births, and too many funerals. The drive from Portland had taken longer than expected, and dusk was already claiming the forest around the property. Through the windows, Douglas firs stood like sentinels, their shadows reaching toward the cabin with an urgency that hadn't been there in previous years. The cognac smell grew stronger as I moved through the main room, following my nose toward the back hallway. It wasn't the pleasant scent of someone enjoying an after-dinner drink. This was the cloying, overwhelming stench of alcohol left too long in the open air, fermented and sour. The smell seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat, intensifying each time I inhaled. My footsteps carried me past family photographs that watched from their frames with eyes that seemed more attentive than they should be. Great-grandfather's stern Victorian face appeared to track my movement, while my father's childhood portrait bore an expression I'd never noticed before. Something wary, almost frightened. The hallway bathroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of the space beyond. As I pushed it open, the cognac aroma hit me like a physical force, so concentrated I had to cover my nose with my shirt. The small room appeared normal at first glance. White subway tiles, pedestal sink, clawfoot tub. But the mirror above the sink commanded attention. A perfect impression of lips pressed against the glass, rendered in deep crimson lipstick that caught the overhead light like fresh blood. The mark was precise, deliberate. Not the casual kiss someone might leave playfully, but something that spoke of desperation or longing. Around the lip print, the mirror remained fogged with condensation that shouldn't exist in the cool, dry air. I reached for the cleaning supplies under the sink, determined to remove what had to be someone's prank. Glass cleaner, ammonia, even the harsh scrubbing powder my grandmother had always used. Nothing touched the mark. The lipstick seemed fused with the mirror itself, as permanent as the silver backing. The condensation, too, refused to clear, reforming immediately after each attempt to wipe it away. Night fell while I worked, and I finally gave up, exhausted and frustrated. The mark would have to wait for daylight and perhaps a trip to town for stronger solvents. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of my reflection in the compromised mirror. The man looking back at me wasn't quite right. Same face, same tired eyes, same 5 o'clock shadow I'd been meaning to shave. But my reflection's hand was raised to his lips, fingers curved as if holding something delicate. A wine glass, perhaps, or a snifter. The gesture was so natural, so familiar, that for a moment I thought I was actually making the motion myself. I checked my own hands, both empty, hanging at my sides. I left the bathroom quickly, but the image followed me. Throughout that first evening, as I unpacked and settled in, I found myself unconsciously raising my hand toward my mouth, catching myself each time with a start. The phantom gesture felt practiced, comfortable, as if I'd been making it for years. The cognac smell had spread through the cabin by morning, no longer confined to the beams but permeating every room, every piece of furniture, every breath I took. It seemed strongest near mirrors, the antique oval glass in the front hallway, the dresser mirror in the master bedroom, even the small cosmetic mirror my aunt always left by the kitchen window. Each surface reflected the same strange condensation, the same subtle wrongness in my reflection. By the second day, I'd stopped trying to clean the bathroom mirror. The lipstick mark had become a landmark of sorts, a fixed point in an increasingly fluid reality. I found myself returning to stare at it, studying the perfect curve of lips I didn't recognize but that somehow seemed familiar. The woman who'd left this mark had full lips, carefully lined and filled. Someone who took time with her appearance, who understood the power of a perfect mouth. But no woman had been to the cabin in months. My family's last gathering had been in early spring, and the caretaker who checked on the property was a gruff man in his 70s who barely spoke. The lipstick should have been impossible. I called my brother that evening, hoping for some explanation, but his voice sounded strange through the phone, distant and hollow. He confirmed that no one had been to the cabin since March, that he'd spoken to the caretaker just last week. When I mentioned the smell and the mirror, the line went quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe you should come home, Jack. Come back early." But I couldn't leave. Something about the cabin held me, drew me deeper into its strange new rhythms. I found myself spending hours in front of various mirrors throughout the house, watching my reflection perform actions I wasn't making. The phantom drinking gesture had evolved into full scenarios. My mirror self would sometimes appear to be engaged in conversation, nodding and smiling at someone just outside the frame. Other times he would pause mid-gesture, as if listening to music I couldn't hear. The nights were the worst. The cabin settled with sounds that seemed too deliberate to be random, floorboards creaking in patterns that suggested footsteps, doors sighing open when I was certain I'd closed them. The cognac smell would intensify in the darkness, becoming so thick I sometimes woke gasping, my lungs heavy with the syrupy sweetness. On the third night, I woke to find condensation covering every mirror in the house. Not just a light film, but heavy droplets that caught the moonlight like tears. I moved from room to room, checking each reflective surface, and found my reflection waiting in every one, but never quite synchronized with my movements. I would turn my head left, and my reflection would turn right. I would raise my right hand, and my mirror self would raise his left. In the bathroom, the lipstick mark had company. Additional prints now decorated the mirror. Not just lips, but the suggestion of a full face pressed against the glass from the other side. The impression was faint but unmistakable. Closed eyes, the curve of a cheek, wisps of hair. Someone was trying to push through from wherever mirrors led. I spent the rest of that night avoiding reflective surfaces, but the cabin seemed determined to show me my face. Every window became a mirror in the darkness. Every polished surface threw back my image with subtle wrongness. My reflection had developed a life of its own, and I began to suspect it was having experiences I wasn't sharing. The phone calls from my family became more frequent and more concerned. My voice, they said, sounded different, rougher, older. I was speaking with words they didn't recognize, using phrases that belonged to another generation. When I asked what they meant, they couldn't explain, only that I didn't sound like myself. But I felt like myself. More like myself than I had in years, actually. The man in the mirrors was becoming more familiar, more comfortable. When I caught glimpses of him drinking from his invisible glass, I could almost taste the cognac on my own tongue, smooth and expensive, with hints of vanilla and oak. It was a taste I'd never developed in life, but that felt like a memory nonetheless. On the fourth morning, I found photographs scattered across the kitchen table. Old pictures I'd never seen before, showing the cabin in different decades. In one, a woman in 1940s dress stood by the bathroom mirror, her lips painted in dark lipstick that looked black in the faded photograph. She was beautiful in the way women of that era were, mysterious, untouchable. Her eyes held knowledge I couldn't decode. Other photographs showed the same woman at different ages, always near mirrors, always with that same knowing expression. In the final picture, she appeared to be elderly, but her lips were still perfectly painted, still that same dark shade. She was reaching toward the bathroom mirror, her fingertips nearly touching the glass. I found a name written on the back of the oldest photograph. Eleanor, 1943. Nothing else. No family connection I could trace. No explanation for why her pictures were in our cabin. But when I looked at her face, I felt recognition settle in my bones like an old ache. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I caught myself humming. The melody was unfamiliar but felt ancient, like something I'd known all my life. When I looked up, my reflection in the kitchen window was humming too, but his lips were moving to different words, forming sounds I couldn't hear but somehow understood. The cognac smell had become part of me by then, so integrated into my perception that I only noticed it when it occasionally faded. In those moments of clarity, the cabin felt hollow and wrong, like a stage with half the props missing. But when the smell returned, and it always did, everything made sense again. I stopped calling my family. Their voices seemed to come from very far away, from a world that had less substance than the one I was discovering in the mirrors. They were concerned about someone who barely existed anymore, someone who had never learned to appreciate good cognac or the company of beautiful women from decades past. My reflection had become my closest companion. We moved together now, perfectly synchronized, as if we'd finally learned the same dance. He no longer seemed to be drinking alone. Sometimes I could see the ghost of another